Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The print shop on Clerkenwell Road smelled of metal and oil, of something burnt and eternal. In the year 1875, when Thomas Wickham was a young man of 22, he had already spent 4 years learning the trade. 4 years of his hands becoming something other than the soft appendages of childhood. They were stained now, permanently darkened at the fingertips and along the creases of his palms, as though the lead type had left its mark not just on the surface, but in the very grain of his skin. He did not mind this. There was honesty in such marks. They told the world, if anyone bothered to look, that here was a man who made things, who contributed something tangible to the machinery of civilization. The shop itself was a cathedral of labor. Rows of type cases stretched along the walls, each compartment containing letters in descending sizes, organized with the precision that only decades of accumulated custom could produce. The smell of the ink roller, thick, slightly sweet, with an undertone of something chemical and faintly ominous, permeated everything. It clung to clothes, to hair, to the air itself. Thomas had grown so accustomed to it that on his rare days away from the shop, the ordinary smell of the street seemed thin and insufficient by comparison. The sound was equally distinctive, the rhythmic percussion of the printing press as it cycled through its motions, the rattle and clink of type being placed and removed, the soft shuffle of paper being fed and collected. These sounds formed the baseline of his existence, a constant music beneath whatever else occurred in his life. His apprenticeship had been arranged through a connection of his mother's, a distant relative who knew the master printer, Mr. Ashford. The arrangement was typical of how such things were done among people of modest means. There was no formal agreement beyond what was understood implicitly. Thomas would work for minimal wages while learning the craft, and in return he would receive the knowledge that would secure his livelihood. His parents, who kept a small grocer's shop in Islington, had regarded this as a good fortune. Their son would not be a shopkeeper like themselves, confined to the narrow margins of retail commerce. He would be a craftsman, skilled in one of the modern trades. This was presented to him as an elevation, and Thomas, who was dutiful even then, had accepted it as such, though he felt the weight of obligation more keenly than triumph. The master printer was a man of 53 or 54, with the appearance of someone who had spent his entire life in the shadow of presses and type cases. His back curved slightly forward, as though he were perpetually leaning toward his work. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, but they held no particular warmth. He ran his shop with the efficiency of someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury that working people could not afford. He paid his workers punctually, but no more than necessary, and he expected in return absolute reliability and precision. Thomas had come to understand over the 4 years of his apprenticeship that this was not cruelty. It was simply the logic of commerce. The world was arranged such that those with capital made decisions, and those without capital executed those decisions as faithfully as possible. The other workers in the shop ranged from boys of 13 or 14 to men in their 40s. There was a natural hierarchy among them, unspoken but absolute. The most skilled compositors occupied the highest positions, commanding the best wages and the most interesting work. Below them were journeymen like Thomas, competent and reliable, but not yet bearing the marks of true mastery. Below them still were the apprentices and the general laborers who carried paper and cleaned equipment. Beneath all of them, though not formally part of the shop's structure, was the awareness of the unemployed men who stood outside sometimes, watching through the windows, a silent threat and a reminder. Work was something to be grateful for, even when it was monotonous and the pay was barely sufficient to keep a person alive. Thomas's particular skill lay in composition, the setting of type for printing. It was work that required not only physical precision, but a certain attunement to language, to the logic of text, to the relationship between individual letters and the larger meanings they formed. He would stand at the composing stick, holding it in his left hand, and with his right hand he would select letters from the type case, placing them one by one in reverse order, building the line from right to left so that when it was printed, it would read correctly from left to right. It was a strange inversion, this backward construction of forward meaning. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before the shop filled with sound and activity, Thomas would contemplate this peculiarity. There was something almost philosophical about it, the idea that meaning emerged through a kind of reversal, that what one created could only be understood when transformed. His wage was 5 shillings and 6 per week, and this was considered respectable for a journeyman of his age and experience. Out of this, he paid 3 shillings for his lodging in a house on Saffron Hill, a narrow building that housed 8 other men and women in its various rooms. The remaining money went to food, and what little remained after that went into a small cloth bag beneath his mattress, the beginning of what might someday become something more substantial. He had calculated, during one of his infrequent moments of ambitious daydreaming, that if he saved carefully and lived frugally, he might accumulate enough in 10 or 15 years to establish his own small printing operation, perhaps a very modest one, producing handbills and small notices for local businesses. It was the sort of dream that working people entertained privately, knowing that it was unlikely, but not impossible, and the knowing of that distinction made the dream sustainable. The print shop was not isolated from the larger world, though it was easy to imagine it that way when absorbed in the mechanics of the work. The papers that passed through their hands every day carried news from across London and beyond. Thomas had learned to read quite well, better than most working people of his station, and he would sometimes pause in his work to absorb fragments of the text he was setting. He knew about Parliament and its debates, about the condition of India under British rule, about the various scandals and crimes that populated the columns of the newspapers. There was a particular fascination in the crime reports, the descriptions of murders and robberies, of moral failings and legal consequences. There was something complete about these narratives, as though crime and punishment formed a kind of closed system that made sense of the chaos around him. It was during this period that Thomas became aware, more sharply than before, of the social hierarchies that structured the world. Mr. Ashford, the master printer, belonged to a different order of humanity than Thomas did. This was not primarily a matter of money, though money was certainly part of it. It was something more fundamental: the right to make decisions, to command others, to move through the world with the assumption that one's preferences would be respected. Thomas observed the way that well-dressed customers entered the shop, and how Mr. Ashford's demeanor changed, becoming deferential, almost flattering in their presence. Then he would turn to address his employees, and his voice would drop in pitch and increase in sharpness. Thomas understood this as natural, as simply how the world was arranged. The wealthy gave orders, and the working people obeyed. There was an elegance to the simplicity of it, even as it struck him as profoundly unfair in a way he could not quite articulate. It was also during this period that Thomas encountered William Hartley again, though not for the first time since childhood. William had been Thomas's friend in the years before apprenticeship, and they had played together in the streets around Islington, as children of that class and circumstance did. Then their paths had diverged. William's family had moved to a different part of London, and the friendship had dissolved into occasional recognition when they passed on the street. But in the spring of 1875, William appeared at the print shop one afternoon. He wore the uniform of a Metropolitan Police constable, and the transformation was striking. He was no longer the boy Thomas remembered, but a man in his mid-20s with a kind of authority that sat on him differently than it sat on Mr. Ashford. There was less weight to it, less assumption of superiority. William had become, through examination and appointment, part of the machinery of order and law. They recognized each other with a strange mixture of familiarity and distance. William had come to the shop not on police business, but simply to commission the printing of notices for a local charitable organization, something to do with an improvement society. The transaction was brief and professional, but afterward William had waited while Thomas finished his work, and they had stepped outside onto Clerkenwell Road for a few minutes. It was a clear spring afternoon, and the street was busy with the usual mixture of commerce and foot traffic. William spoke easily about his years since they had last seen each other, about his work as a constable, about the state of order and disorder in London. He seemed pleased with his position, and there was something in his manner that suggested he regarded Thomas with a kind of sympathy, as someone who remained in the position that William had managed to escape. Thomas had felt, in that brief conversation, a kind of envy, and also a kind of relief. Envy because William had clearly found a route out of the purely working class, into something that commanded more respect and more security. Relief because Thomas's path, while less clearly elevated, was at least established. He knew what his days would consist of. There was comfort in that knowledge. When they parted, they exchanged addresses and a promise to meet again, though both of them seemed to understand that their lives were now moving in different directions, that the friendship of childhood could not simply be resumed, but would have to be renegotiated on new terms. In the months that followed this encounter, Thomas became aware that his position in the print shop, while secure, was also fixed in a particular way. He was valued for his skill and reliability, but he was not on any trajectory toward advancement. Mr. Ashford's son worked in the shop as well, learning the trade from a position of greater privilege and advantage. It was understood that eventually the son would inherit the business. or would use his father's connections to establish his own operation. Thomas's future, by contrast, seemed to have been determined the day he entered the shop as an apprentice. He would remain a journeyman compositor, skilled and respected within his particular sphere, but not advancing beyond it. The realization was not crushing. There was dignity in skilled work, and he was paid enough to maintain himself in modest comfort. But it was a realization nonetheless, one that formed a kind of quiet background to his days. The print shop became, in these years, not just a place of employment, but a kind of world unto itself. Thomas knew the rhythms of the work intimately, knew which jobs required particular care, which clients were likely to be difficult, which compositors worked fastest, and which produced the most perfectly accurate work. He knew where the weak spots in the presses were, knew which of the other men could be relied upon, and which were prone to laziness or mistakes. This knowledge gave him a kind of security. It meant he was valuable, that he could not be easily replaced. But it also meant that his consciousness, day after day, was absorbed into the mechanics of work. His mind, when not actively engaged in composition, tended to wander into abstract territories. He thought about the nature of meaning, about the strange fact that letters, which were merely marks, could contain entire worlds of significance. He thought about the people who read the words that he and his colleagues set into type, the readers distributed throughout London and beyond who would encounter the meanings that had been constructed, letter by letter, in this shop. By the time he was 25, in the year 1877, Thomas had been composing for 7 years. He was skilled enough that Mr. Ashford sometimes gave him the more delicate work, broadsides with intricate layouts, small books with careful typography. He had taken rooms of his own, a slight elevation from the boarding house where he had initially lived, in a building on Golden Lane. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it was his own space, and this mattered to him more than he would have admitted. He could close the door and be away from the constant presence of other people. He could think his own thoughts without the mediation of crowds or noise. There were books on a shelf that he had acquired gradually, volumes purchased from street vendors or borrowed and never returned, a poetry collection, a philosophical text on logic, a history of printing in England. He read slowly, sometimes taking weeks to finish a single short book, but the reading was important to him. It connected him to a larger world of ideas, even as his daily work kept him confined to the particular world of the shop. His social life remained minimal. He attended church occasionally, more from habit than conviction, finding in the ritual something aesthetically pleasing but spiritually hollow. He had acquaintances among the other workers in the shop, and he would sometimes join them for a drink at one of the public houses near Clerkenwell. But these friendships remained superficial. There was an unspoken agreement among working men that certain conversations were acceptable and others were not. One did not discuss one's hopes or fears with colleagues. One did not reveal too much of one's inner life. The boundary between companionship and loneliness was maintained. And it seemed to Thomas that this was simply how things had to be, given the nature of the world they inhabited. It was during this period that Thomas developed what might be called a philosophy of caution. He observed the world carefully, noting which men advanced and which remained static, which made mistakes that cost them their positions, which suffered sudden reversals of fortune due to circumstances beyond their control. He came to understand that the world was not arranged according to merit or justice, but according to a more complex calculus in which luck played a significant role. The careful man, he concluded, was the man who minimized his exposure to chance. This meant following the rules, performing his work competently, avoiding the kind of notice that might attract unwanted attention from those with power. It meant not asking for more than one was given, not complaining about conditions that could not be changed, not forming alliances that might later prove problematic. It was a philosophy of invisibility, though Thomas did not frame it in those terms. And yet, beneath this philosophy of caution, there was something else, a kind of suppressed kindness that occasionally manifested in small gestures. When a younger apprentice made a mistake in composition, Thomas would sometimes correct it quietly, without reporting the error to the foreman. When he learned that one of the other workers was suffering from illness and had no resources to pay a doctor, Thomas quietly contributed a small amount toward the cost of treatment, making the donation through an intermediary so that the man would not know its source. These acts were not conscious expressions of a moral principle, but rather small rebellions against the fundamental hardness of the world, expressions of a recognition that other people suffered in ways that were not always visible, and that small acts of consideration could sometimes ease that suffering. He kept these acts hidden, even from himself, treating them as though they were merely practical solutions to particular problems, rather than expressions of an underlying moral sensibility. The print shop, for all its constraints and its limited opportunities for advancement, offered one genuine treasure: access to knowledge. Through the papers that passed through his hands, Thomas encountered ideas and information that would otherwise have been closed to him. He read about scientific discoveries, about political movements, about the history of distant lands. He learned through composition the names of important people and events. He absorbed, through the very process of setting type, a kind of education in the world. This was not formal education. He would never attend university or receive any kind of official credential, but it was real nonetheless. It shaped how he thought about the world and his place in it. It introduced him to the possibility that the world operated according to certain principles that could be understood if one paid careful attention. By the end of his 27th year, in 1879, Thomas had settled into what seemed likely to be the basic pattern of his adult life. He was a skilled compositor, earning a reasonable wage. He had his own room. He had a few acquaintances and one genuine friend in William, with whom he occasionally corresponded and whom he saw several times a year. He had books and the quiet pleasure of reading. He had his work, which gave structure and meaning to his days. It was not the life he had sometimes dreamed of in his youth. He had not established his own printing business, had not married, had not achieved any particular distinction. But it was a life that he understood, that fit the shape of his abilities and circumstances, that offered a kind of modest stability in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and uncertain. The future, when he allowed himself to contemplate it, appeared to stretch before him in much the same pattern, year after year, until age and infirmity rendered him unable to work. It seemed in many ways like a reasonable bargain with fate: security in exchange for ambition, comfort in exchange for distinction. He did not know then that this bargain was about to be disrupted, that the very caution that had guided his life so far would, in time, become something else entirely. The lodging house on Saffron Hill had undergone a subtle transformation in the autumn of 1883. Thomas, now in his early 30s, had returned to shared quarters after several years of maintaining his own room on Golden Lane. The decision had been practical rather than sentimental. His savings had been depleted by a period of illness 2 years prior, a fever that had kept him away from work for 6 weeks, and the loss of income during that time had forced a careful recalculation of his circumstances. Rather than watch his modest reserves dwindle further, he had taken the more economical option of returning to a shared house. In many ways, it felt like a return to an earlier version of himself, a reversal that stung slightly, with the implication that whatever progress he had made was not as secure as he had believed. The house itself was much the same as he remembered. Narrow stairs, thin walls that transmitted every sound from neighboring rooms, a communal kitchen where the residents prepared their meals or took them from the pot that Mrs. Briggs, the landlady, maintained perpetually on the stove. Mrs. Briggs was a woman of 60 or so, widowed and childless, who had transformed the management of her house into a kind of calling. She knew the habits of every resident, could predict with reasonable accuracy when the rent would arrive and when excuses would need to be made, could sense disturbance in the small ecosystem of her domain as readily as a barometer registers changes in atmospheric pressure. She was not unkind, but she was firm in her insistence on order and propriety. The house was respectable, which in her estimation meant that there were to be no women of uncertain reputation, no excessive drinking, no theft. These rules were maintained through a combination of Mrs. Briggs's constant vigilance and the implicit understanding that violation of them would result in immediate expulsion. It was into this familiar but circumscribed world that Edgar Crane had entered, some 4 months before Thomas's return to the house. Edgar occupied the room directly adjacent to Thomas's, separated by a wall that was thin enough to allow the transmission of sound, but thick enough to preserve the basic fiction of privacy. The first impression Thomas had of his new neighbor was auditory rather than visual. He heard, through the wall, the sound of a man moving about the room with a kind of confident energy that seemed unusual in a place where most residents moved quietly, as though trying to minimize their presence. There was music sometimes, played on a small phonograph that Edgar had acquired, strange and modern music that did not conform to the traditional melodies that Thomas was accustomed to hearing. There were conversations, too. Edgar seemed to receive visitors more frequently than the other residents, and these conversations often extended late into the evening, conducted in animated tones that suggested debate or intellectual discussion, rather than the quiet socializing that usually occurred in such places. When Thomas and Edgar finally encountered each other directly, it was on the stairs of the house on a Saturday morning. Edgar was descending, while Thomas was ascending, and they had to navigate past each other in the narrow space. Edgar was a man of perhaps 38 or 39, with dark hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, and a kind of restless energy that seemed barely contained within the boundaries of his physical form. He dressed better than the other residents of the house. His suit, while not fashionable, was clearly well made and carefully maintained. His shoes were polished to a high shine. There was something about his appearance that suggested he regarded himself as temporarily residing in such a place, as someone who was passing through rather than permanently situated. When their eyes met, Edgar smiled with the kind of ease that Thomas associated with people who had been raised to expect friendliness from the world. "New neighbor, I gather," Edgar had said, extending his hand. "Edgar Crane, journalist and occasional scribbler of nonsense." Thomas had accepted the handshake somewhat cautiously. The open friendliness was unusual, and he found himself uncertain how to respond to it. In his experience, men in lodging houses maintained a basic civility, but did not typically initiate conversations with strangers or introduce themselves with self-deprecating humor. Yet, There was something magnetic about Edgar's manner, something that made caution seem like an overreaction. Thomas had found himself responding, had given his own name, and had found that Edgar had immediately suggested they might take dinner together the following evening. This had begun a friendship that would, over the following years, become one of the defining relationships of Thomas's adult life. Edgar was, in many ways, everything that Thomas was not. Where Thomas was cautious, Edgar was impulsive. Where Thomas performed his work with meticulous precision and little comment, Edgar was a talker, someone who seemed to need to articulate his thoughts constantly, as though the thought that was not expressed did not fully exist. Edgar worked irregularly as a journalist and writer, contributing articles to various newspapers and periodicals, though never with any regularity or security that would have allowed him to maintain his own independent lodgings. He had, or so he claimed, once been engaged to marry, but had broken the engagement when he discovered that his intended was not sympathetic to his intellectual interests. He spoke of radical politics and new ideas with the fervor of someone who believed that the world could be reformed if only people of sufficient intelligence and courage could be gathered to the cause. He frequented certain coffee houses and literary establishments where, he claimed, one encountered people of real importance and influence. To Thomas, Edgar was like a door opening onto a larger world. Through Edgar, he learned the names of writers and thinkers he had never encountered. He heard arguments about the nature of society, about justice and inequality, about the possibility of reform. Edgar had lent him books, volumes of philosophy and political theory, novels by contemporary authors that dealt with social problems in a way that the respectable literature Thomas had previously read did not. There was an intoxication to these new ideas, a sense that there was more to think about and consider than the daily mechanics of work and survival. More than this, there was the intoxication of being befriended by someone who seemed to regard Thomas as worth talking to, as someone whose thoughts and observations were valuable. Edgar had a way of asking for Thomas's opinion about things, of seeming genuinely interested in what he thought, that was entirely unlike any relationship Thomas had previously experienced. Yet beneath the attraction was something else, something that Thomas's philosophy of caution ought to have detected and flagged as problematic. Edgar was, despite his charm and his wit, fundamentally unreliable. He would arrange to meet Thomas and then disappear for days, returning eventually with elaborate explanations about unexpected journalistic assignments or urgent business that had called him away. He borrowed money frequently, always with elaborate promises of repayment that rarely materialized. He would speak with great conviction about his plans and schemes, a journal he was going to establish, a book he was going to write, connections he was going to cultivate with important editors and publishers. But these plans never seemed to advance beyond the stage of enthusiastic conversation. There was something exhausting about Edgar, though this exhaustion was intermingled with fascination in a way that made it difficult for Thomas to step back and evaluate the relationship clearly. It was during this period that Thomas became conscious in a new way of his own loneliness. Before Edgar, this loneliness had seemed like a natural state, something that was simply the condition of being a working man without family connections or particular social position. But Edgar's friendship had revealed to him that companionship was possible, that it was possible to have conversations that extended beyond the practical and the mundane, that there were people in the world who seemed interested in what one thought. The loss of this companionship when Edgar disappeared was sharper than Thomas would have anticipated. He found himself checking the wall between their rooms for sounds, listening for Edgar's footsteps on the stairs, looking for him in the coffee houses that Edgar had introduced him to. It was also during this period that Margaret entered Thomas's life, though for a long time the entering was so gradual and circumstantial that it barely registered as an event. The laundry where Margaret worked was located on the same street as the print shop, and Thomas would pass by it several times a week, sometimes stopping to make inquiries about having his shirts washed. Margaret worked in the front room of the establishment, receiving and distributing the clothing that was brought to be laundered. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of worn appearance that Thomas had come to recognize as characteristic of women who worked in such places. Her hands were reddened and rough from the constant exposure to hot water and caustic soaps. There were lines around her eyes that suggested either hardship or concentration, or perhaps both. Their interactions, at first, were purely transactional. Thomas would bring his shirts to be washed, Margaret would receipt them, and he would return at the designated time to collect them. There was nothing in these exchanges to suggest anything beyond the ordinary commerce of service provision. Yet over time, a kind of recognition had developed. Margaret began to remember that Thomas preferred his shirts washed a particular way, not too much starch. When his shirts were ready, she would set them aside rather than mixing them in with the general pile. There were small courtesies exchanged. Thomas would ask how the work was. Margaret would mention changes in the laundry's operations or comment on the weather. These interactions were still completely bounded by propriety and professional distance. Yet they had acquired a kind of texture that suggested something beyond mere transaction. Thomas found himself making excuses to pass the laundry more frequently than was strictly necessary. If he needed only one shirt washed, he would wait until he needed 2 or 3 before making the trip. He began to notice small things about Margaret. The way she moved through her work with a kind of efficient grace. The occasional moments when a slight smile would cross her face at something amusing. The way her voice, when she spoke, carried an undertone of sadness that seemed to exist beneath the surface of her words. He recognized in her something of his own caution, as though she too had learned to move through the world carefully, making herself smaller than she needed to be, expecting little and accepting less. It was William, his old friend from childhood, who was now a police constable, who provided the first real insight into Margaret's circumstances. They had begun to see each other more regularly in recent years, meeting occasionally for dinner or a walk through the city. William seemed to have a kind of official knowledge about the people and events of London that came from his work, and once, when Thomas had mentioned Margaret in passing, William had revealed what he knew. Margaret's sister had disappeared 3 years earlier, under circumstances that were never entirely clear. She had been young, only 19, and she had left home one morning saying she was going to meet a friend, and had never returned. The family had searched and had reported her missing to the police, but there had been no trace of her. The generally accepted assumption was that she had met with some misfortune, though whether that misfortune had been accidental or deliberate was not known. The disappearance had devastated the family, William explained, particularly Margaret's mother, who had died less than a year after the event. This knowledge, once possessed, altered how Thomas regarded Margaret. The sadness that he had sensed beneath the surface of her demeanor now seemed comprehensible. She was not simply a woman of modest circumstances doing unrewarding work. She was a woman who had lost someone dear to her, who had experienced a kind of rupture in the fabric of her life from which she had apparently not recovered, and probably would not recover. The realization made him feel toward her something that he had not felt in years, a kind of protective sympathy, an awareness that she was suffering in ways that were largely invisible to the world. He began to be even more deliberate in his visits to the laundry, began to try, in small ways, to make her work easier or more pleasant. When he brought clothing, he would fold it carefully so that it would be simpler to process. He would comment favorably on the quality of her work. Once, when he observed that she seemed particularly tired, he had offered to pay extra for expedited service, which she had accepted, though with a kind of embarrassment that suggested the offer had felt more intimate than the simple transaction that it was meant to be. Thomas's life during this period had acquired a kind of equilibrium, though one that was precarious and seemed to contain within it various tensions and contradictions. At work, he remained the same careful, reliable compositor he had always been, performing his duties with the precision and lack of emotion that Mr. Ashford demanded. At home, in the lodging house, he existed in a state of ambivalent attachment to Edgar, drawn to his company and his ideas, but never fully at ease with him, always slightly unsure of where he stood or what Edgar truly thought of him. In the interstices of daily life, he was conscious of Margaret, thought about her frequently, imagined conversations between them that never actually occurred, and maintained a polite distance that seemed to be the only appropriate course given the circumstances of their respective positions. His relationship to money and security had shifted subtly as well. The loss of his independent room and the reduction in his savings had made him acutely conscious of how quickly the small protections that he had built could be stripped away. He began to save again, with even more deliberation than before, becoming almost obsessive about the tracking of pennies and shillings. Yet at the same time, Edgar's requests for money had become more frequent and more difficult to refuse. There was something about Edgar that made refusal seem like a betrayal of friendship, as though the lending of money was a form of proof that one's claims of friendship were genuine. Thomas found himself on several occasions giving money to Edgar that he had set aside for his own savings, all the while telling himself that this was temporary, that Edgar would eventually repay it, that their friendship was worth this small sacrifice. By 1884, Thomas had been living in the lodging house for nearly a year. The initial shock of the reduction in his circumstances had faded somewhat, though it had not entirely disappeared. He had adjusted to the sounds and rhythms of shared living, had come to know the other residents in the casual way that such proximity inevitably produced. There was Mr. Fletcher, a compositor like himself, who was perhaps 10 years older and who had experienced his own reversals of fortune. There was young Billy, an apprentice at a cooperage, who was saving money to establish his own workshop. There was Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who did needlework and who maintained an almost complete isolation from the other residents, eating her meals alone in her room and speaking only when absolutely necessary. Mrs. Briggs moved among them all, maintaining order, collecting rent, commenting on the state of their morals and their prospects with the kind of interested concern that suggested she regarded the house and its residents as her particular responsibility. It was during this period that Thomas became aware of certain conversations that occurred late at night in Edgar's room. There were visitors who came after dark and who spoke in low voices about matters that Thomas could not quite make out, but which seemed to carry an undertone of urgency or secrecy. He would hear fragments, references to specific individuals by name, discussions of money and transactions, mentions of places in the East End and other parts of London that Thomas did not frequent. He told himself that these conversations were not his concern, that it was none of his business what Edgar did in his private time. Yet there was something about the tone of these conversations that troubled him. Some instinct that suggested they related to activities that were not entirely legitimate or above board. When he considered raising the matter with Edgar, he found himself unable to do so. The question seemed to require too much directness, too much willingness to accuse Edgar of wrongdoing or impropriety. The habit of caution that had governed so much of his life made it easier simply not to ask, not to know, not to involve himself in things that did not directly concern him. His relationship with Edgar during this period had also taken on a new dimension. Edgar had become more absent, less inclined to the long conversations that had initially drawn Thomas into his orbit. There were still moments of connection, still occasional evenings when Edgar would seek out Thomas's company, and they would talk late into the night about philosophy or politics or the state of the world. But these moments were becoming less frequent, and when they occurred, Thomas was conscious of a kind of performance in Edgar's manner, as though Edgar were playing the role of intellectual companion rather than genuinely inhabiting it. There was also an increasing economic dimension to their relationship. Edgar owed Thomas a considerable sum of money by this point, money that Thomas had lent with the clear understanding, stated or unstated, that it would eventually be repaid. Yet Edgar seemed to regard the debt with a kind of casual indifference, as though the money that had been so precious to Thomas was, in Edgar's world, merely a temporary shifting of resources between friends. It was also during this period that Thomas began to understand, at some level that he did not fully articulate even to himself, that his caution had a cost. By refusing to know what Edgar was actually doing, by lending money without asking too many questions, by maintaining his distance from Margaret, even as he thought about her constantly, he was not protecting himself, but rather making himself complicit in circumstances that he did not fully understand. The philosophy of invisibility that had served him well in his work at the print shop seemed to function differently in the realm of human relationships. It allowed him to avoid difficult confrontations, but it also meant that he was allowing others to define the terms of connection. He was being used, he suspected, by Edgar, even as he was also being enriched by the friendship in ways that were difficult to deny. He was allowing Margaret to remain distant and isolated, telling himself that this was appropriate given their respective stations, while she perhaps would have welcomed some kind of genuine connection. He was, in short, protecting himself through a kind of deliberate unknowing that was beginning to feel less like wisdom and more like cowardice. By the spring of 1885, Thomas had accumulated a particular kind of consciousness about his own life. He was 32 years old. He had been working in the print shop for more than 13 years. He had no wife, no children, no clear prospects of significant change in his circumstances. He lived in a rented room in a shared house. He had friendships, but they were all characterized by a kind of guardedness, a refusal to fully open himself to the people around him. He had dreams of a different life, but these dreams seemed increasingly unlikely to materialize. At the same time, something in him was becoming restless, was beginning to resist the philosophy of caution that had governed so much of his existence. He did not know what form this resistance would take, did not know what circumstances might force him to act rather than simply observe and endure. But there was a stirring, a sense that the carefully maintained equilibrium of his life was about to be disrupted, though he could not have predicted from what direction the disruption would come, or what form it would ultimately take. The autumn of 1887 arrived in London like an unwelcome guest, bringing with it not only the traditional dampness and darkness of the season, but also a particular quality of fear that seemed to settle over the city like the fog itself. By this time, Thomas was 34 years old, still living in the lodging house on Saffron Hill, still working as a compositor at Mr. Ashford's shop. The murders in Whitechapel, which had begun in the spring and intensified through the summer and into the autumn, had created a kind of collective anxiety that penetrated even the most ordinary moments of daily life. Women clutched their purses more tightly. Men walked with a kind of heightened wariness. The newspapers that passed through Thomas's hands at the print shop were saturated with accounts of the crimes, with speculation about the perpetrator, with theories and accusations and expressions of public outrage. It was impossible, in that time, to move through the world without being conscious of the possibility of sudden violence, of the fragility of human life, of the existence of evil that did not conform to the ordinary categories of understanding. The fear was particularly acute in certain parts of London, particularly in the East End, where the murders had occurred. But it radiated outward from that geography, creating a kind of ambient dread that affected even the more respectable neighborhoods where Thomas lived and worked. There was a sense that the ordinary protections of civilization, the police, the constabulary, the forces of order, were inadequate to the challenge. The murderer, who had come to be called by various names in the newspapers, most memorably Jack the Ripper, remained at large despite intensive police efforts. With each unpunished crime, the sense of vulnerability and chaos seemed to deepen. The social order that had seemed so fixed and immutable just months before now appeared fragile, as though it might at any moment collapse into something far more primitive and anarchic. It was in this atmosphere of collective unease that the event occurred which would in time come to define Thomas's life, though he could not have known it at the moment it happened. He had been walking home from the print shop on an evening in late October, moving through streets that were already beginning to fill with the thick fog that London produced in this season. The fog was not merely an absence of light, but a positive presence, a kind of tangible substance that seemed to contain within it all manner of danger and obscurity. It was the kind of weather that made people walk faster, that made them more conscious of the sounds around them, that turned ordinary streets into something strange and threatening. The gas lamps along the street created only the faintest halos of light, so that the fog seemed to dissolve them rather than being dispersed by them. Thomas had taken what he thought was his usual route, though the fog had made the familiar streets almost unrecognizable. He had become slightly turned around and had paused for a moment to orient himself, to determine which direction would take him most directly to the lodging house. It was during this pause that a woman had emerged from the fog, moving quickly, with a kind of desperate urgency. She had appeared almost without warning, as though materialized from the fog itself. She was young, perhaps 30 or 35, with dark hair, and a face that, even in the poor light, suggested she was not a woman of the streets, but rather someone of respectable employment or circumstances, who had encountered some kind of crisis. She had looked at Thomas with an intensity that had caught him off guard, and without saying anything, she had taken his hand and pressed something into it, a small piece of paper, folded and tightly creased. Then, before he could react or speak, she had turned and disappeared back into the fog, her form dissolving into the murk before Thomas could do more than register her disappearance. For a moment, Thomas had stood frozen, uncertain whether what had just occurred had actually happened, or whether he had somehow imagined it. The fog seemed to contain the evidence of the encounter within itself, refusing to give it back. He had looked down at his hand and discovered that he was indeed holding something, a small piece of paper, perhaps torn from a newspaper, folded so that its contents were not immediately visible. His first instinct had been to unfold it immediately and discover what it contained. But something about the urgency of the woman's manner had suggested that this should be done privately, away from the street. He had instead placed the paper carefully in his coat pocket and had made his way, with somewhat more deliberation than usual, back to the lodging house. Once in his room, with the door closed behind him and a candle lit, he had unfolded the paper and discovered that it was indeed a newspaper clipping. A small article from one of the penny papers, perhaps 2 inches square. It was about a woman who had been reported missing from a lodging house in the East End 3 years prior. The article was old, yellowed, and the print was somewhat faded, as though the clipping had been handled many times or had been exposed to dampness. But more striking than the condition of the clipping was the fact that it bore marks, small pencil marks that appeared to have been made deliberately, marking certain letters or portions of text. When Thomas looked at these marks carefully, he began to understand that they formed a kind of code or message. Certain letters were circled. Certain words had marks beside them. It took him some time to decipher the pattern, but eventually he began to understand that the marked letters, when extracted from the text, formed words. The message, when he finally extracted it completely, read, "Crane knows. Crane must answer. Lives depend." The discovery had produced in Thomas a complex mixture of emotions and thoughts. The first reaction had been a kind of simple curiosity about what the message meant, and why the woman had felt compelled to place it in his hands. The second reaction had been a growing sense of unease as he considered the implications of the message. Crane. Edgar Crane. The woman had marked the clipping in a way that only someone familiar with print and typography would understand. She had somehow known that Thomas, as a compositor, would be capable of deciphering her message. She had sought him out deliberately, and the message she had left suggested that Edgar was involved in something that had consequences for multiple people, possibly including missing or endangered women. Thomas had spent that night in a state of considerable agitation. He had not slept, but had instead sat in his room, reading and rereading the clipping, considering and reconsidering the implications of what had occurred. By the time morning came, he had arrived at a decision, though it was a decision made with considerable reluctance. He would not, he decided, reveal the clipping to anyone. He would not confront Edgar about it. He would not report the matter to the police or to any authority. The reasoning behind this decision was complex and not entirely rational, even by his own estimation. Part of it was caution, a fear that if he revealed what he knew, he might involve himself in something dangerous or criminal, in a way that would threaten his precarious livelihood and standing. Part of it was loyalty to Edgar, a sense that, despite their friendship's complications and despite his suspicions about Edgar's activities, to betray him would be a fundamental violation of the bond between them. Part of it was a kind of paralysis in the face of the unknown, a sense that he did not possess sufficient information to act responsibly, and that therefore the most responsible course was to remain silent. Instead of acting, Thomas had hidden the clipping. He had found a loose board in the floorboards of his room and had placed the clipping there, concealing it from view. He had told himself that he was protecting it, keeping it safe until such time as he might understand better what it meant and what he should do about it. But in truth, he was also hiding it from himself, deliberately placing it out of sight as a way of managing his anxiety about what it represented. If he did not see the clipping, he could almost manage to forget about it. He could almost maintain the fiction that the encounter in the fog had been some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, that the woman had been desperate and confused, that the message was not as sinister as he had interpreted it to be. In the days and weeks that followed the encounter, Thomas found himself watching Edgar with new attention, looking for signs or evidence that might confirm or deny his suspicions about Edgar's involvement in some kind of criminal enterprise. Edgar seemed, outwardly, much as he had always been, preoccupied with his journalistic work, frequently absent from the lodging house, returning at odd hours, continuing to request loans of money that Thomas found it difficult to refuse. But now, when Edgar spoke, Thomas found himself listening for undertones, for hidden meanings, for evidence of duplicity or concealment. Edgar's conversation, which had once seemed to Thomas to be the expression of a genuinely complex and interesting mind, now struck him as potentially performative, as though Edgar were playing a role designed to maintain a particular image while concealing his true activities and intentions. The encounter with the woman had also crystallized something else in Thomas's mind. The woman had borne a certain resemblance to someone, and it took him several days to identify who. She had resembled, though not exactly, Margaret. Or rather, she had resembled what Margaret might look like in the future, should something occur to break her spirit entirely, or to subject her to great suffering. The realization had troubled him deeply. When William had explained to him years earlier that Margaret's sister had disappeared, he had filed the information away as sad, but not particularly relevant to his own life. But now, with the clipping in his possession and the message it contained, Margaret's loss had acquired a new and more immediate significance. He had begun to wonder whether Margaret's sister had been among the victims of whatever enterprise Edgar might be involved in. The possibility filled him with a kind of horror and guilt that he found difficult to manage. It was also around this time that William had appeared again in Thomas's life, this time with an apparent deliberateness that suggested something more than coincidence. William had sought out Thomas at the print shop, had asked him to meet for dinner at a quiet public house not far from Clerkenwell Road. Thomas had accepted, though with some trepidation, unsure what William might want to discuss. When they had sat down together in a private corner of the public house, William had begun to speak in a low voice about the disappearances in the East End, about the police's investigation into organized trafficking of women, about the involvement of certain individuals who had connections to journalism and to various businesses that seemed respectable on the surface, but which had connections to more questionable activities. William had not named Edgar directly, but he had asked, with a careful kind of indirection, whether Thomas knew anything about Edgar's activities or associates, whether Thomas had noticed anything unusual about Edgar's recent behavior or his patterns of coming and going. Thomas had been caught off guard by the questioning. He had wanted to deny any knowledge, to maintain his silence and his position of uninvolvement. But something about William's directness, about the implicit suggestion that Thomas might possess information that could be relevant to an official investigation, had made complete denial seem not only dishonest, but also potentially obstructive. And so Thomas had found himself in a kind of middle position, acknowledging that he had noticed certain things about Edgar that seemed unusual: the late-night visitors, the conversations conducted in low voices, the financial transactions that did not seem to correspond to any legitimate journalistic work. But he had also, almost reflexively, found himself protecting Edgar to some degree, suggesting that the observations might be misinterpreted, that Edgar was eccentric, but not necessarily criminal, that his own knowledge was too limited to support any serious conclusions about Edgar's activities or character. William had listened to this response without comment, had seemed to accept it at face value, though Thomas sensed that William had understood that Thomas was withholding something. After their conversation had ended and they had parted ways, Thomas had been left with a profound sense of ambivalence. He had satisfied, to some degree, the implicit requirement to provide information to the police without having fully betrayed Edgar. Yet he had also, through this partial revelation, involved himself in the investigation in a way that he had hoped to avoid. He could no longer maintain the fiction that he knew nothing and bore no responsibility. During the winter that followed, Thomas's life acquired a peculiar quality of strain. On the surface, everything remained unchanged. He went to work at the print shop. He performed his duties as a compositor. He lived in the lodging house. He maintained his cordial but distant relationship with the other residents. But beneath this surface, he was experiencing a kind of constant tension between his desire to remain uninvolved and his growing sense that involvement was perhaps unavoidable. The clipping remained hidden in the floorboards of his room, and he found himself sometimes overcome with the urge to retrieve it, to look at it again, to confirm that his interpretation of the message was correct. Other times, he would deliberately avoid his room, spending additional hours at the print shop or walking the streets of London, as though the physical act of movement might somehow resolve the internal conflict that he was experiencing. The fog that had characterized the autumn seemed to persist, metaphorically if not literally, through the winter and into the early months of 1888. It was a fog that was both external and internal, a kind of obscurity that prevented clear sight either of the world around him or of his own situation. News came, through the newspapers and through conversations with William, that the investigation into the trafficking operations was progressing, that certain individuals had been arrested, that evidence was being accumulated. Yet this progress seemed to occur in a realm that was separate from Thomas's immediate experience. Edgar continued to live in the room adjacent to his, continued to be absent and present in roughly equal measure, continued to conduct conversations of mysterious significance with visitors who came and went at odd hours. The tension between them, though nothing was said directly about it, seemed to grow more acute. There were moments when Thomas wondered if Edgar suspected that he had spoken to William, if Edgar sensed some kind of betrayal or exposure. At other times, Thomas wondered if Edgar even knew that Thomas existed in any meaningful way, or if he regarded him simply as a convenience, a source of loans, and a neutral presence in the lodging house that did not require significant attention. It was also during this period that Thomas found himself paying more attention to Margaret. He increased the frequency of his visits to the laundry, sometimes bringing clothing that did not truly need to be washed, simply as a pretext for seeing her. On one occasion, he had found her looking particularly exhausted, and he had asked, in a somewhat awkward manner, if everything was well. She had responded with a kind of distant politeness that had discouraged further inquiry, but he sensed beneath her response a kind of private sorrow that had acquired new dimensions. He wondered if, like him, she was experiencing an increase in anxiety related to the crimes and disappearances that had occurred in the city. He wondered if she had received news about her sister, or if the investigation into the trafficking operations had brought new knowledge or new pain. He wanted to ask her to share with her the fact that he knew about her sister, to offer some kind of comfort or acknowledgement. But the habit of caution that had guided so much of his life held him back. He could not break the silence that had existed between them without risking an intimacy that seemed presumptuous, that might be unwelcome, that might alter the careful equilibrium that allowed them to coexist in proximity without genuine connection. By the spring of 1888, more than half a year had passed since the encounter in the fog. The newspapers had moved on from the murders, though the fear they had engendered had not entirely dissipated. The investigation into trafficking had continued to progress, and there had been arrests and charges brought. Thomas still possessed the clipping, still hidden in the floorboards of his room. He had never again seen the woman who had given it to him, had never learned her identity or her ultimate fate. Edgar remained in the room adjacent to his, and the question of what Edgar did and what he was involved in remained, for the most part, unanswered. William had not approached him again with questions or requests for information, though Thomas was aware that William was aware of him, that he existed in some category of William's mind as a person who possessed knowledge that might be relevant to official matters. Thomas existed at this moment in time in a state of suspension between past and future, between innocence and knowledge, between caution and the dawning awareness that caution itself could be a form of complicity. He did not know that his decision to remain silent about the clipping and the message it contained would have consequences that would eventually reshape his entire life. He did not know that the moment of encounter in the fog, which he had tried so hard to minimize and forget, would come to be recognized as a moment of genuine crisis, a moment when someone had appealed to him and he had not responded. He continued to move through his days with the same surface calm that had always characterized his life. But beneath that calm, something was beginning to shift, beginning to crack, beginning to give way to a different kind of consciousness about himself and his place in the world. The summer of 1888 arrived with a peculiar intensity, as though the season itself had absorbed something of the anxiety that had characterized the preceding months. Thomas, now in his mid-30s, had developed a kind of double consciousness. The external Thomas, who continued to move through his days with mechanical precision, performing his work at the print shop, maintaining his modest lodgings, engaging in the minimal social interactions that his position required, and the internal Thomas, who was consumed by a constant preoccupation with the clipping hidden in his room, with the woman in the fog, with the implications of Edgar's activities, with the knowledge that he possessed information that might be relevant to matters of significant consequence. This doubling of consciousness had become, by this point, almost habitual. He had learned to function while simultaneously being partially absent from his own life, as though part of his attention was always elsewhere, engaged in the repetitive examination of questions that he had deliberately chosen not to resolve. The print shop during these months had acquired a particular intensity of activity. The newspapers that had previously been dominated by accounts of the Whitechapel murders and speculation about the perpetrator had, in the months following the cessation of the murders, in the autumn of the previous year, gradually turned their attention to other matters. Yet the demand for printed materials seemed to increase rather than diminish. There was a kind of public hunger for information and narrative, a need to process the events that had occurred through the medium of the printed word. The shop had expanded its operations slightly to accommodate the increased demand, and there was a sense among the workers that they were engaged in something that mattered, that the stories they were setting into type were significant and consequential. For Thomas, however, this significance had taken on a different quality. The letters that he placed in the composing stick, the words that he assembled, the pages that he helped to produce, all of these seemed to carry for him a kind of burden of meaning that went beyond their literal content. He was conscious, in a way he had not been before, of the power of print to shape perception and to disseminate information. And he was also conscious that this same power could be used to obscure truth, to mislead, or to conceal. It was during one of these intense periods of work, in late June or early July, that a fellow compositor named Robert had made a casual remark that had struck Thomas with unexpected force. They had been working together on a broadside, announcing a public meeting related to the investigation of crimes in the East End. Robert had commented, in the manner of someone making idle conversation, that it was remarkable how quickly people forgot about such matters, how the public seemed to have moved on from the crimes that had consumed their attention just months earlier, as if it never happened. Robert had said, with a kind of shrug that suggested indifference. Next week, there will be something else, and no one will remember the women who died. The remark had troubled Thomas more than Robert's casual manner seemed to warrant. It had seemed to articulate something that Thomas had been struggling to formulate, something about the relationship between knowledge and action, between awareness and responsibility. The women who had died, and by extension, the women who had disappeared, the women who had been subject to trafficking and exploitation, these women continued to exist in the world, continued to suffer the consequences of what had been done to them, regardless of whether the public maintained its attention or moved on to other matters. And Thomas, who possessed a small piece of information about one such case, who had been entrusted by a desperate woman with a message, continued to carry that knowledge in silence. He had constructed a kind of narrative in his mind to justify this silence. The narrative that he lacked sufficient information to act responsibly, that to reveal what he knew might cause harm, that his loyalty to Edgar, despite everything, was more important than his responsibility to strangers. But Robert's casual remark had suggested to him, with uncomfortable clarity, that this narrative was perhaps merely a sophisticated form of evasion, that his silence was not protective but rather permissive, that by choosing not to act, he was, in a real sense, choosing to allow the status quo to continue unchanged. In the weeks that followed this exchange with Robert, Thomas found himself experiencing an increase in physical symptoms of the internal stress that he was experiencing. He slept poorly, often waking in the middle of the night with a sense of anxiety that he could not quite locate or define. His appetite diminished. He became more withdrawn than usual, which in itself was remarkable, given how withdrawn his ordinary manner already was. His colleagues at the print shop seemed to notice the change in his demeanor, though none of them commented on it directly. Mr. Ashford, the master printer, had remarked once that Thomas seemed distracted, that his work, while still competent, was not achieving its usual standard of precision. The observation had stung, because Thomas took pride in his work, prided himself on the reliability and accuracy that he brought to his trade. That this pride was being undermined by matters entirely external to the work itself had seemed to him both unjust and inevitable. The lodging house during this same period had acquired a particular kind of tension that seemed to Thomas to mirror his own internal state. Edgar was present less frequently than ever, often absent for several days at a time without explanation. When he did appear, there was a kind of agitation about him that suggested he was preoccupied with matters of significant importance or concern. His visitors, when they came, seemed to manifest a similar quality of urgency. The conversations that Thomas could partially hear through the thin walls of his room had acquired a tone that suggested negotiation or conflict, as though deals were being struck or disagreements resolved. One evening in July, Thomas had heard Edgar engaged in what seemed to be an argument with someone. Voices raised, though not so raised that the content of their disagreement was entirely clear. Afterward, Edgar had been absent from the house for nearly a week, and when he had returned, he had seemed both more defiant and more anxious than before, as though he had won some kind of victory, but at a cost that he was not entirely comfortable acknowledging. Thomas had found himself during this period increasingly conscious of Mrs. Briggs and her awareness of what was occurring in her house. Mrs. Briggs was a woman of limited formal education, but possessed of a kind of practical intelligence and perceptiveness that was formidable. She seemed to notice everything: the arrivals and departures of residents, the nature and frequency of their visitors, the sounds emanating from their rooms, the quality of their financial dealings with her. She commented frequently on the various moral and financial failings of her residents, not in a harsh manner, but in the way of someone who had come to regard the management of her lodging house as a kind of moral enterprise. One afternoon, when Thomas had been paying his rent, Mrs. Briggs had made a remark about Mr. Crane, commenting that she had observed certain irregularities in his pattern of residence and his associations, and that she wondered how long such a situation could be sustained. The remark had been made in a kind of indirect way, as though she was testing to see whether Thomas would confirm her suspicions or provide additional information. Thomas had responded with carefully neutral comments, neither confirming nor denying, and had changed the subject as quickly as possible. But the exchange had reinforced his growing awareness that Edgar's activities, whatever they might be, had not gone entirely unnoticed by others. It was also during this period that Thomas's interactions with Margaret acquired a new dimension. He had continued to visit the laundry with increasing frequency, and Margaret had in turn begun to acknowledge his visits with something more than the minimum courtesy that propriety required. They would exchange small comments about the weather, about the state of the neighborhood, about the peculiar rhythms of their respective work. There was nothing in these exchanges that transgressed the boundaries of appropriate commercial interaction. Yet there was something in their cumulative effect that suggested a kind of tentative recognition, as though each of them was becoming aware of the other as a person, rather than simply as a function or role. It was during one of these interactions that Thomas had quite inadvertently revealed something of his own state of mind. Margaret had asked, with a tone that suggested genuine inquiry rather than mere politeness, whether he was well. He had responded with automatic reassurance, but something in his demeanor had apparently betrayed the fact that his response was not entirely truthful. Margaret had said, in a voice that was quiet and direct, "You look as though you were carrying something heavy." The observation had struck Thomas with the force of genuine recognition. He had wanted in that moment to unburden himself, to tell Margaret about the clipping, about his knowledge of her sister, about his conflicted feelings regarding Edgar, and his responsibilities in light of what he knew. But the context was wrong, the time was wrong, and his own habits of caution were too deeply ingrained. Instead, he had responded with vague comments about the pressure of work and the anxieties of the times. Comments that were true, but also carefully insufficient. Margaret had accepted his response without pressing further, but he had sensed in her acceptance a kind of understanding that suggested she recognized the particular quality of burden that he was experiencing. Perhaps because she carried her own burden of loss and uncertainty regarding her sister. In that moment, the distance between them had seemed not to decrease, but rather to acquire a different quality. It was no longer simply the distance between two people of different stations, but also the distance between two people who were each privately suffering in ways that they could not quite articulate. By mid-August, Thomas had become conscious of a particular kind of impasse in his own mind and circumstances. The situation with Edgar could not, he was beginning to understand, remain indefinitely suspended in its current state. Either something would occur that would force a resolution, or he would need to take some kind of deliberate action to bring the situation to a point of clarity. Yet the thought of taking such action filled him with a kind of paralysis. He did not want to betray Edgar, even though he was increasingly convinced that Edgar was engaged in activities that were both criminal and deeply harmful. He did not want to involve himself more deeply in matters that did not directly concern him, even though he was beginning to understand that his refusal to involve himself was itself a form of involvement. He did not want to act on the basis of incomplete information, yet he recognized that complete information might never be available to him, and that the pursuit of it might constitute a justification for perpetual inaction. It was during this period of internal conflict that William had appeared again, this time seeking Thomas out at his lodging house rather than arranging a meeting at a neutral location. The visit had been unexpected and had created a kind of subtle disruption in the household. Mrs. Briggs had greeted William with a particular kind of deference that suggested she recognized him as representing authority, and she had conveyed to Thomas that he had a visitor downstairs with an intensity that suggested the visit was unusual and potentially significant. When Thomas had come down to the front parlor where William was waiting, he had found his old friend looking somewhat careworn, as though the investigation that he had been engaged in over the preceding months had taken a toll on him that was not merely physical but also emotional or spiritual. William had come, as it turned out, not with new questions but with information. The investigation into the trafficking operations had progressed to a point where charges were being brought against several individuals, including Edgar Crane. The evidence that had been accumulated included testimony from several women who had come forward to describe the systems of coercion and exploitation that they had been subject to. The investigation had revealed a network that extended beyond what had initially been suspected, involving journalists and editors who had used their positions in the press to facilitate trafficking and to conceal the activities of the network. Edgar was not the primary figure in this network, but he appeared to have played a significant role as a facilitator and recruiter. William had been indicating, in a careful and circumspect manner, that the police would soon be moving to arrest Edgar, and that they were attempting to gather all available evidence before doing so. As William had delivered this information, Thomas had felt something shift within him, as though a carefully constructed dam had broken and some internal flood had been released. The knowledge that he had been carrying, the clipping, the message, the implications of the woman's desperate appeal, all of this had suddenly acquired a new kind of urgency and relevance. He had found himself, without entirely intending to do so, revealing to William the details of the encounter in the fog, the clipping with its coded message, the fact that he had possessed this information for nearly a year without revealing it to anyone. He had expected, in revealing this information, to feel some kind of relief or vindication. Instead, he had felt something closer to shame, a recognition that his silence, which he had justified in terms of caution and loyalty, had extended the time period during which Edgar's activities could continue undetected, and that there were likely consequences to that extended silence. Consequences that had fallen on people whom he had never met and whose suffering he had been able to ignore only by virtue of his deliberate refusal to know about them in any concrete way. William had listened to Thomas's revelation with an expression that was difficult to read. Not angry, certainly, but perhaps disappointed, or perhaps simply tired. He had asked to see the clipping, and Thomas had retrieved it from its hiding place in the floorboards of his room. When William had examined it, he had confirmed that the message Thomas had decoded matched information that had been provided by the woman who had given him the clipping, a woman named Emma, who had since been located and had become a key witness in the investigation. The fact that Emma had been found, that she was alive and willing to testify, had seemed to Thomas like a kind of grace, a mitigation of what might otherwise have been an entirely tragic sequence of events. Yet William's demeanor suggested that Emma's survival and willingness to testify had come at considerable cost, that her experience of the trafficking operations had been brutal and damaging in ways that finding her and locating her safety had not been able to entirely remedy. In the weeks that followed this conversation, the investigation reached its culmination. Edgar was arrested at his place of employment, and the arrest was noted in the newspapers with a kind of scandalous attention that suggested the involvement of a journalist and editor in the trafficking operations was particularly noteworthy because it represented a kind of perversion of the role that the press was meant to play in society. Thomas read the newspaper accounts of the arrest and the subsequent investigation with a kind of abstract awareness that this was his former friend being described, that these were the activities that he had suspected but had not fully confirmed, that his own silence had been concurrent with Edgar's continued freedom to act. Yet he did not know whether his silence had actually mattered in any material sense, whether, if he had acted earlier, the outcome would have been different, or whether the investigation would have proceeded on much the same timeline, regardless of his intervention or lack thereof. The uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the situation to bear. The knowledge that he would never know with any degree of certainty what difference his actions or inactions might have made. Mrs. Briggs had remarked, after Edgar's arrest, that she had always known there was something wrong with him, that she had observed signs of his moral degradation from the moment he had first taken rooms in her house. The remark had been delivered in a tone that suggested she regarded this assessment as validating her judgment and her management of her household. Thomas had not contradicted her, but he had found her comments somewhat troubling. The suggestion that Edgar's criminality was simply an expression of a fundamental defect in his character, rather than something more complex, a product of choices and circumstances, and a particular species of moral failure, had seemed to Thomas to be both too simple and yet also uncomfortably accurate. Edgar was indeed guilty of what he had been charged with, and this guilt had genuine consequences for the women who had been subject to his actions. Yet Edgar was also a man whom Thomas had known, whom Thomas had regarded as a friend, whose company Thomas had valued. The coexistence of these truths was uncomfortable and not easily reconciled. By late September, as the summer gave way to autumn once again, Thomas found himself in a state of peculiar suspension. Edgar was in custody, awaiting trial. The investigation had concluded its active phase, though the legal proceedings would continue for months or years. Thomas had given a statement to the police, had potentially become a witness who might be called to testify at trial. His involvement in the matter had become, despite his hopes to the contrary, formalized and public in a certain sense, though the details of his involvement had not yet been disclosed in the newspapers. Margaret had learned, through the communication networks that circulated through the working quarters of London, that the investigation had involved trafficking operations, and that a woman named Emma, whose name meant nothing to her at first, had been located and had provided testimony. It was only when Thomas had, in a moment of tentative connection, carefully revealed to Margaret that he knew something of what had occurred, that Margaret had understood the significance of the name Emma. For several days after Thomas had told her, Margaret had seemed both distant and intensely present, as though she was processing some kind of profound emotional shift that had to do with knowledge of her sister that she had not possessed before, hope that she had not dared to harbor, and perhaps a complex mixture of other emotions that he did not have access to and did not presume to understand. The autumn of 1888 proceeded with a kind of relentless momentum that seemed to accelerate rather than diminish as the season progressed. Thomas was now 35 years old. Though age seemed to have acquired a different significance in his life, it was no longer simply the accumulation of years, but rather the marker of his movement from one state of existence to another, a transition that he had not chosen and that he was still struggling to comprehend. The print shop had returned to something approaching its ordinary patterns of work, though the newspapers continued to carry accounts of the investigation and of Edgar's case with a regularity that ensured that the matter remained in the public consciousness and, more significantly for Thomas, remained in his own thoughts with an intensity that he could not entirely manage. Each time he set type for an article that referenced the investigation or the crimes that had preceded it, he experienced a kind of doubling of consciousness. He was simultaneously performing his ordinary work and confronting a narrative in which he himself appeared, in however shadowy a form, as a participant. It was during the second week of October that William had appeared at the print shop without advance warning. His arrival during working hours was unusual and had immediately attracted the attention of Mr. Ashford and the other workers present. William had requested to speak with Thomas, and Mr. Ashford, though clearly annoyed by the interruption to the work, had permitted Thomas to step outside for a conversation. On the street outside the shop, William had explained that there had been a significant development in the investigation. Edgar had been arrested, not only for his involvement in the trafficking network, but also for his suspected involvement in the disappearance of a woman 3 years prior. This woman had never been located, and her disappearance remained technically an open case, though suspicion had long centered on the trafficking network. The development was significant because it connected the trafficking investigation to crimes that predated the trafficking operations by several years, suggesting a longer and more extensive pattern of criminal activity than had initially been understood. William had also indicated that he wanted Thomas to confirm the details of the clipping that he had shown to the police. The woman who had given Thomas the clipping, Emma, was now willing to provide additional testimony about how she had come into possession of it, how she had created the coded message, and how she had selected Thomas as the recipient. The police wanted to understand with as much clarity as possible exactly what Thomas's role had been in the encounter, what he had understood about it at the time, and what he had done with the information that he had received. William had also, somewhat delicately, inquired whether Thomas might be willing to testify at trial, should the case proceed to that stage. He had explained that Thomas's testimony might be valuable in establishing the nature and extent of Edgar's activities, in confirming the authenticity of the clipping, and in demonstrating the deliberate nature of the trafficking network's operations. The suggestion that Thomas might need to testify had filled him with a kind of dread, yet he had found himself unable to refuse. The events had moved beyond the point where refusal was a viable option. When William had finished explaining the situation, he had asked if there was anything else that Thomas might know, any other detail that he had not yet mentioned. Thomas had hesitated before responding, and in that hesitation he had recognized that he was, once again, standing at a kind of crossroads, where his choice to reveal or conceal information would have real consequences. He had then told William about his observations of Edgar's behavior over the preceding years, about the late-night visitors, about the conversations he had partially overheard, about his gradual recognition that Edgar was involved in something that was not legitimate. He had explained how he had come to know William's sister and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, and how the realization that Margaret's sister, Emma, had been one of the victims had forced him to confront the personal dimensions of what had previously seemed like an abstract matter of crime and investigation. William had listened to all of this without interruption, and when Thomas had finished, William had made a remark that had struck Thomas with unexpected emotional force. "You could have told me this months ago." The statement was not accusatory in its tone, but it carried within it an implication of disappointment and a kind of gentle rebuke. Thomas had attempted to explain his reasoning, the caution that had guided his silence, the conflicting loyalties that had prevented him from acting more decisively. William had listened to these explanations with what appeared to be patience, though Thomas sensed beneath the patience an understanding that the explanations, whatever their validity, did not change the fact that silence had had consequences. "The thing about conscience," William had said, in a manner that suggested he was speaking from experience, "is that it is not satisfied by explanations. It simply marks the difference between what you did and what you might have done, and leaves you to carry that difference forward." The conversation had concluded with practical arrangements. Thomas would be contacted by the police when it was time for him to give a formal statement. He would likely be asked to appear at preliminary hearings, and possibly at trial. In the meantime, he should consider whether there was any additional information that he might recall about his interactions with Edgar, or about anything he had observed that might be relevant to the investigation. When William had left, Thomas had returned to the print shop and to his work, but the equilibrium that he had managed to maintain through months of careful compartmentalization had been disrupted. The investigation was no longer something that he could observe from a distance. He was now implicated in it, would be called upon to participate in the formal processes of law and justice, and the knowledge that he possessed would become, inevitably, part of the public record. The weeks that followed were characterized by a peculiar quality of waiting. Thomas went about his ordinary life, working at the print shop, maintaining his lodgings, moving through the routines that had defined his existence. But all of this was undertaken against a background of anticipation and anxiety. He received a summons to provide a formal statement to the police, which he did in a small office in a police station in Clerkenwell. The process had been more formal and more emotionally demanding than he had anticipated. The police constables who had conducted the interview had been respectful, but also methodical and exhaustive, asking him to recount every detail of his encounter with Emma in the fog, every observation he had made about Edgar's activities, every conversation that he could remember. The process had forced him to articulate things that he had previously only held in his own mind, to transform private knowledge into public testimony, to accept that his understanding of these events was now embedded in an official record that would persist beyond his own existence. During this same period, Margaret had undergone her own transformation in response to the knowledge that her sister had been located. The news that Emma was alive, that she had come forward to testify, that she had been identified and had entered into contact with the authorities, all of this had created a kind of upheaval in Margaret's emotional and psychological state. Thomas had been aware of this upheaval primarily through the indirect medium of Margaret's changed demeanor when he visited the laundry. She seemed simultaneously lighter and more fragile than before, as though a weight had been lifted, but that lifting had also left her vulnerable to new forms of pain. He had become aware, through brief and carefully modulated conversations, that Margaret was attempting to contact Emma, to establish some kind of relationship with her sister after years of believing her to be dead or beyond recovery. The process was complicated by the fact that Emma was now a witness in an active investigation, and her whereabouts and circumstances were not entirely public knowledge. But through persistent inquiry and the assistance of William, Margaret had eventually been able to arrange a meeting with her sister. It was Margaret who told Thomas, in a conversation that occurred several weeks into this sequence of events, that she had met with Emma. She had come to his lodging house to tell him this, which was itself unprecedented. Margaret had never before visited him at his residence, had never crossed the boundary between the transactional space of the laundry and his private life. The visit had been announced to Mrs. Briggs with a careful neutrality that had suggested Margaret understood the potentially compromising nature of a young woman visiting a young man's lodging house. And Mrs. Briggs, showing an unusual discretion, had simply directed Margaret to Thomas's room, without commentary. When Margaret had arrived, she had looked both exhausted and illuminated, as though she was carrying inside herself some profound emotional experience that she was still attempting to process and understand. She had explained that she had spent an entire afternoon and evening with Emma, that they had talked for hours about what had happened to her, about the years she had been missing, about the circumstances of her enslavement to the trafficking network, about her eventual escape, and her decision to come forward to the police. Margaret had said in a voice that was barely steady that she did not recognize her sister entirely, that the woman who sat before her was not the young girl who had left the house 3 years earlier, but rather someone transformed by experience in ways that could not be undone or ameliorated. Yet there had also been, Margaret reported, a kind of grace in the encounter, a sense that even though the loss and the damage could not be erased, the fact of connection, the fact of knowing that her sister had survived and had achieved a kind of agency and dignity in coming forward, this fact mattered. This fact meant something. Margaret had also explained that Emma had asked about Thomas, had wanted to know the details of how he had come to be entrusted with the clipping, what his reaction to it had been, what had prompted him eventually to reveal it to the police. Thomas had been startled to learn that Emma knew anything about him beyond the bare fact that he had been the recipient of her coded message. Margaret had explained that Emma had been interested in understanding why Thomas had taken so long to reveal the information, what had prevented him from acting more quickly, whether his delay in revealing what he knew had had real consequences. Emma had not asked these questions in an accusatory manner, Margaret had said, but rather as someone who was attempting to understand the complex dynamics that governed how people responded to knowledge of injustice and suffering. Thomas had asked Margaret what she had told Emma in response to these questions. Margaret had hesitated before answering, and in her hesitation, Thomas had perceived that she was deciding how much of what she felt about him she was willing to articulate. She had said, finally, that she had attempted to explain that Thomas seemed to be a man for whom the process of understanding something and the process of acting on that understanding did not always proceed at the same pace, that he seemed to move through the world with a kind of caution that protected him, but that also sometimes prevented him from engaging with situations as fully or as immediately as might have been ideal. She had also said that she thought Thomas had perhaps not realized, until quite recently, that his own inaction could be a form of action, that by choosing not to know and not to act, he was making a choice that had consequences for others. The conversation with Margaret had been difficult for Thomas to hear, yet he had recognized in her words a kind of truth that he had been gradually becoming aware of himself. The philosophy of caution that had guided so much of his life had indeed protected him. It had allowed him to maintain a kind of stability and security in a precarious world. But it had also meant that he had failed to take responsibility for the situations in which he found himself implicated through knowledge or proximity. The encounter with Emma in the fog had been a moment of genuine choice, even if Thomas had not fully recognized it as such at the time. She had appealed to him, had trusted him with a message, and with the implicit request that he act on the information she was providing. His silence had been a choice not to honor that appeal, not to take responsibility for what he had been offered. In early November, as the autumn was giving way to winter, Thomas received notification that he was to appear at preliminary hearings regarding Edgar's case. The hearings were to be held at a magistrate's court, and Thomas's testimony was expected regarding the nature of his relationship with Edgar, his observations of Edgar's activities, and the circumstances of his encounter with Emma and his receipt of the coded clipping. The prospect of appearing in court, of testifying under oath, of having his words recorded and potentially reported in newspapers created in Thomas a state of genuine anxiety. He rehearsed what he might say, considered how to respond to possible questions, attempted to prepare himself for the emotional experience of participating directly in the formal machinery of law and justice. On the morning of the hearing, Thomas dressed carefully in his best clothes, a suit that was respectable if not fashionable, a shirt that Margaret had washed and starched with particular care, shoes that he had polished to the highest shine that he could achieve. He made his way to the courthouse with a sense of unreality, as though the events of the preceding weeks had been something that he had read about or imagined rather than directly experienced. The courthouse itself was an imposing building, and Thomas was conscious as he entered it of how little he understood about the formal processes that were about to unfold. He was directed to a waiting area where several other people were present, some of whom he recognized as having some connection to the investigation. William was there, and he had greeted Thomas with a kind of sympathetic recognition that suggested he understood the difficulty that Thomas was experiencing. When Thomas was eventually called to testify, he was led into a courtroom where a magistrate sat elevated above the ordinary floor level, where lawyers for both the prosecution and the defense were positioned at tables, and where Edgar sat in a kind of enclosed box, separated from the rest of the courtroom as though he had been removed from the ordinary category of people. Thomas was asked to state his name and his occupation, to swear or affirm that he would tell the truth, and then to answer questions posed by the prosecution's lawyer regarding his relationship with Edgar, his observations of Edgar's activities, and the circumstances of his encounter with Emma and his receipt of the coded message. The process of testifying had been both easier and more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. Easier, because once he had begun to speak, the words had come relatively naturally, because he was primarily recounting facts and observations that were matters of record in his own mind. More difficult, because the questions sometimes pushed him toward interpretations and judgments that he was not entirely comfortable making, that required him to articulate suspicions rather than certainties, and that implicated him in the very events that he was describing. When the defense lawyer had asked him questions designed to suggest that he might have misinterpreted Edgar's actions, that there might be innocent explanations for Edgar's behavior and associations, Thomas had found himself having to articulate his reasons for believing that Edgar's activities were indeed criminal and harmful. The most difficult moment had come when the defense lawyer had asked Thomas directly about his delay in revealing what he knew about the coded clipping. Why, the lawyer had asked, had Thomas waited so long before providing this information to the police? What had prompted him, after months of silence, to suddenly come forward? The questions had been designed, Thomas understood, to suggest that his testimony was unreliable, that his delay in reporting might indicate either confusion about what had actually occurred or a willingness to fabricate details. Thomas had struggled to provide an answer that was both truthful and comprehensible. He had explained that he had been uncertain about the significance of what he had received, that he had not wanted to involve himself in matters that did not directly concern him, that he had hoped that the situation would somehow resolve itself without his intervention. As he had articulated these reasons, he had become aware that they sounded, to the ears of others listening to him, like excuses or evasions rather than genuine explanations. When he had finally been released from the witness box, Thomas had felt a sense of profound exhaustion, as though the process of testifying had extracted something from him that could not easily be replenished. He had left the courthouse and had made his way somewhat aimlessly through the streets of London. He had not returned immediately to his lodging house or to the print shop, but had instead walked, allowing his feet to carry him through neighborhoods that were both familiar and strange, through the dense and often dreary geography of London's working quarters. As he walked, he had found himself reflecting on the experience of being questioned in court, of having his private understanding transformed into public testimony, of having his choices and his motivations examined by people with whom he had no prior relationship, and who were attempting to construct narratives that would support particular conclusions about Edgar's guilt and innocence. By the time he had returned to the print shop the following morning, he had achieved a kind of acceptance regarding his role in these events. He had done what he could do. He had testified truthfully about what he knew and what he had observed. Whether his testimony would be sufficient to ensure that Edgar faced the consequences that Thomas increasingly believed he deserved remained to be seen. But at least he had now taken some kind of responsibility for what he knew. At least he had acknowledged, in a formal and public way, that he possessed knowledge of crimes, and that he was willing to participate in the processes designed to address those crimes. It was also around this time that Margaret had begun to appear more regularly in Thomas's life, not simply as the operator of a laundry, but as a person with whom he was gradually developing a kind of genuine connection. They had begun to take walks together on Sunday afternoons, moving through the parks and streets of London in a companionship that was becoming increasingly comfortable and increasingly conscious of its own nature. Margaret had shared more about her family's experience of loss, about how the knowledge that her sister was alive had altered her sense of what was possible, about how she was beginning to imagine a future that was not entirely constrained by the tragedy of the past. And Thomas, in turn, had begun to reveal something of his own inner life, his own fears and hopes, his growing recognition that the caution that had protected him had also impoverished him, that life conducted at a distance from genuine engagement with others was perhaps not life as fully lived as might be possible. The winter of 1888 and into the spring of 1889 was characterized by a peculiar mixture of legal proceedings and the gradual transformation of Thomas's private life. He was now 35 years old, though the events of the preceding months had aged him in ways that were not merely physical. His hair had begun to show threads of gray at the temples. His face had acquired lines that seemed to speak of worry and reflection. Yet at the same time, there was something in his bearing that had begun to change, a kind of straightening of his shoulders, a slight increase in the directness of his gaze, as though the burden of silence had been replaced by a different kind of weight, one that was perhaps more difficult to bear, but that felt somehow more legitimate, more in accordance with some principle that he was still attempting to articulate to himself. The preliminary hearings had concluded with findings sufficient to send Edgar's case forward to trial. The magistrate had determined that there was probable cause to believe that Edgar had been involved in the trafficking of women, that he had used his position as a journalist to facilitate these activities, and that he was implicated in at least one disappearance that had occurred prior to the discovery of the formal trafficking network. The newspapers had reported these findings with varying degrees of sensationalism, some emphasizing the scandal of a journalist's involvement in such crimes, others focusing on the individual stories of the women who had been trafficked. Thomas had found himself, through no intention of his own, becoming a minor figure in the newspaper accounts. He was referred to obliquely as a lodging-house associate who had come forward with important evidence, though his name was not published. The print shop had acquired a curious status in relation to these events. On the one hand, the work continued much as it always had. Newspapers were produced, broadsides were printed. The machinery of the shop functioned with undiminished regularity. On the other hand, there was a peculiar consciousness among the workers that they themselves were part of the machinery through which the story of the crimes and the investigation was being disseminated. Mr. Ashford had made one comment with a kind of dry satisfaction, that the scandal had certainly increased the sales of certain publications, that crime and criminality appeared to be good business for the newspaper industry. The remark had troubled Thomas somewhat, as it seemed to suggest that the harm that had come to the trafficked women was merely the raw material for a commercial enterprise, that their suffering was being transformed into profit through the medium of print. It was during the winter months that Thomas began to be contacted by various authorities and investigators in connection with expanding aspects of the investigation. The initial focus on Edgar and the trafficking network had begun to extend, as investigations sometimes do, into related matters. It emerged that Edgar had had connections to other individuals involved in various forms of exploitation and criminal activity, and that some of these connections extended back several years. Thomas was contacted and asked to describe, in as much detail as possible, the visitors who would come to see Edgar at the lodging house, the conversations that he had overheard, any details about Edgar's financial arrangements or his associations. The questions were detailed and persistent, and Thomas found himself functioning to some degree as an unofficial informant regarding Edgar's activities and the architecture of the criminal network that had been discovered. This role as an informant was not one that Thomas had sought or desired, yet it seemed to have fallen naturally to him given his proximity to Edgar and his willingness to cooperate with the investigation. There were moments when he felt uncomfortable with the role, when he wondered whether providing such detailed information about Edgar constituted a betrayal, even in light of what Edgar had done. But he had come to understand that Edgar's actions had constituted betrayals on a far more profound scale. Betrayals of trust, of human dignity, of the very concept of ethical relationship between people. Whatever discomfort Thomas felt about his role in the investigation seemed, in comparison, to be a relatively insignificant matter. It was also during this period that the investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that the trafficking network had been operating for a considerably longer time than had initially been understood. Evidence emerged indicating that the disappearance of Margaret's sister Emma 3 years earlier had not been an isolated incident, but rather one of several disappearances that appeared to be connected to the same network of criminal activity. This discovery altered the scope and nature of the investigation in important ways. What had initially seemed to be a relatively localized matter of trafficking had gradually been revealed to be a much more extensive operation, one that extended back in time and that involved multiple perpetrators and facilitators. The revelation had been both validating and deeply troubling for Margaret. It had confirmed her long-standing suspicion that her sister's disappearance was not a random tragedy, but rather the result of deliberate criminal action. But it had also meant that the machinery of justice would need to address not simply the most recent crimes, but also older crimes that had been concealed for years. Through William, Thomas learned that Emma was cooperating extensively with the investigation, providing details not only about her own experience, but also about other women who had been trafficked and who had not yet come forward, or who might no longer be alive. Emma's testimony was proving to be invaluable in constructing a comprehensive understanding of how the network had functioned, who the key figures had been, what methods had been used to recruit and control victims. The process of providing this testimony was taking a toll on Emma, however. William had mentioned in one of their conversations that Emma was experiencing significant emotional distress related to the process of articulating her experiences in formal settings, of having her private trauma transformed into legal testimony and public record. It was Margaret who had requested that Thomas accompany her to meet with Emma. The request had been made tentatively, with a kind of awareness that she was asking something of him that extended beyond their ordinary interactions. She had explained that Emma wanted to meet him in person, wanted to understand better what his relationship to the events had been, and wanted to thank him for the role that he had played in bringing the investigation to her sister. Thomas had been uncertain about the meeting, but had agreed to it, recognizing that in some sense he owed it to Emma to respond to her desire for personal connection. The meeting had taken place in a small cafe not far from Margaret's lodgings, a discreet location that suggested William's careful coordination in arranging something that would be both accessible and private. Emma was visibly different from the desperate woman who had appeared in the fog nearly 2 years earlier. She was better nourished, better dressed, and she carried herself with a kind of determined dignity that suggested she had begun the process of reclaiming some agency over her own life. Yet there was also something in her bearing that suggested she was marked by her experiences in ways that would not easily fade. She had greeted Thomas with a kind of formal courtesy that had seemed at first distant, but that he had gradually come to understand was a protective mechanism, a way of maintaining some control over an interaction that had emotional dimensions that might otherwise overwhelm her. Emma had thanked him for the role that he had played in the investigation, for his willingness eventually to reveal the information that he had received from her. She had acknowledged that his initial silence had extended the time period during which she and others were subject to the trafficking network. But she had also expressed understanding for the difficult position in which he had found himself. "I do not know what I would have done in your situation," she had said, with a kind of quiet authority that suggested she was speaking from genuine reflection rather than from a place of resentment. "I had placed my faith in a stranger based on nothing but instinct and desperation. I did not have the right to expect that you would immediately understand the weight of what I was giving you." The conversation had gradually expanded to encompass the broader investigation, the revelations that had emerged about the extent of the trafficking network and the prospects for justice. Emma had explained that several of the women who had been trafficked were willing to testify, and that their collective testimony was creating a comprehensive picture of how the network had functioned. She had also explained that the process of preparing to testify at trial was psychologically difficult, that it required her to relive traumatic experiences in formal settings, that it created a curious mixture of hope that justice might be achieved, and fear that the process itself might not result in consequences sufficient to balance the harm that had been done. Over the course of the following weeks and months, as the investigation continued to develop and as preparation for trial proceeded, Thomas found himself increasingly integrated into a network of people who were all, in various ways, engaged with the consequences of the trafficking crimes. William continued to provide updates about the investigation and about what to expect at trial. Margaret and Emma gradually developed a relationship characterized by cautious affection and the effort to recover something of the sibling connection that had been interrupted by years of separation and trauma. And Thomas found himself functioning as a kind of bridge between these relationships, connected to each of them through the peculiar circumstances that had drawn them all into proximity to the investigation. By late spring of 1889, as the trial date approached, Thomas had come to occupy a kind of altered position in the world. He remained a compositor at the print shop, remained a resident of the lodging house on Saffron Hill, maintained the same external patterns of work and residence that had characterized his existence for years. Yet within this unchanged exterior structure, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer invisible in the way that he had been before. People knew who he was now, understood that he had played a role in bringing about consequences for serious crimes. His name had appeared in official documents. His face had been seen by magistrates and lawyers and police constables. He had been transformed through these experiences from a man whose existence was entirely private and unremarked into someone who had a small but measurable place in public proceedings. This transformation was not unmixed in its quality. There were moments when Thomas found himself wishing that he could return to his previous state of invisibility and obscurity, that he could undo the chain of events that had drawn him into involvement with the investigation. Yet he had also come to understand that the invisibility that he had previously sought and maintained had not been a form of freedom, but rather a form of constraint, a way of limiting his own existence and of avoiding the responsibilities that came with knowledge and proximity to injustice. The altered state in which he now existed was more uncomfortable in many ways, but it was also more authentic, more in alignment with what he was beginning to understand as the proper relationship between individual conscience and collective responsibility. It was during this period that Thomas and Margaret's relationship had gradually transformed from the tentative and carefully bounded interactions that had characterized their earlier meetings into something more substantive and intimate. They had begun to speak of the future, tentatively at first, and then with increasing directness. Margaret had confessed that she had been aware of Thomas's regard for her for a considerable period of time, that she had reciprocated it, but had been uncertain about how to express it given their different circumstances and the complexities of their situation. Thomas had, in turn, expressed his realization that the philosophy of caution that had protected him for so long had also prevented him from engaging in life as fully as he might have done, and that he wanted to attempt, with Margaret, to imagine a different kind of future, one that included a kind of genuine partnership and shared commitment, rather than the isolated and carefully circumscribed existence that he had previously maintained. By June of 1889, as the trial date loomed closer, Thomas had received notification that he would indeed be called to testify at trial. The defense had indicated that they would challenge certain aspects of his testimony from the preliminary hearings, that they would attempt to establish alternative interpretations of Edgar's activities and of the significance of the coded clipping that Thomas had received from Emma. The prospect of extended cross-examination at trial filled Thomas with a kind of dread. Yet he had also come to accept that this was part of the price that he was required to pay for his eventual decision to participate in the investigation. The trial itself was scheduled to begin in July. In the weeks preceding it, Thomas experienced a peculiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He continued to work at the print shop, continued to walk through the ordinary rhythms of his life, but all of this was undertaken against a background consciousness of the approaching trial and what it would require of him. Margaret had offered support and understanding, and their conversations had increasingly taken on the quality of two people planning together, making decisions about a future that they were beginning to imagine as a shared enterprise. William had provided practical guidance about what to expect at trial, about how to respond to questions, about the importance of maintaining composure and clarity, regardless of the tactics employed by the defense. In the first week of July, as summer settled over London with its peculiar mixture of heat and lingering dampness, the trial had begun. Thomas had appeared on the stand, had provided his testimony regarding his relationship with Edgar, his observations of Edgar's activities, his encounter with Emma in the fog, and the receipt and eventual revelation of the coded clipping. He had been cross-examined by the defense attorney, had experienced the discomfort of having his credibility questioned, his memory challenged, his motivations examined and reinterpreted. Yet he had maintained his composure and his commitment to accuracy. He had not embellished or exaggerated his testimony. He had acknowledged the limitations of his knowledge and the extent to which his interpretations of Edgar's activities had been based on suspicion rather than direct evidence. What Thomas had not fully anticipated was the cumulative effect of hearing the testimony of all the other witnesses, the trafficked women who came forward to describe their experiences, the other individuals who had been involved in the network, the police constables and investigators who provided technical evidence about how the network had functioned. The trial had constructed a comprehensive narrative of crimes that was far more extensive and far more disturbing than Thomas had fully appreciated when he was simply providing his own portion of testimony. The realization of the scale of the criminal enterprise, of the number of people who had been harmed, of the systematic nature of the exploitation, all of this had created in Thomas a sense of the genuine importance of what had been achieved through the investigation and the trial process. His own small role in that process had come to seem, in this context, to be genuinely meaningful. By the time the trial had concluded in late July, with guilty verdicts rendered against Edgar and several other defendants, Thomas had found himself transformed once again into a different kind of person. Someone who had participated in the machinery of justice, who had seen that machinery function, who understood now that one person's testimony, combined with the testimony of many others, could result in consequences for serious crimes. The verdicts had been reported prominently in the newspapers. The journalists who covered the trial had praised the witnesses who had come forward, had particularly emphasized the courage of the trafficked women who had provided testimony. Thomas's own testimony had been noted, though without particular emphasis or drama. He remained a minor figure in the narrative that the newspapers constructed about the trial, yet he understood that his minor role had had significance. The courtroom was quieter on the day of sentencing than it had been during the trial itself. There was less of the press of bodies, fewer of the journalists and curious observers who had filled the galleries during the weeks of testimony and evidence presentation. Yet the absence of spectacle did not diminish the significance of what was about to occur. Thomas sat in one of the public benches, his hands folded in his lap, his attention focused on the magistrate who sat elevated above the courtroom floor, invested with the authority to determine the consequences that would follow from the guilty verdicts that had been rendered. Beside him, though not directly adjacent, propriety still governed such matters, Margaret sat with her hands gripped tightly together. Behind them, William occupied a position that suggested his official capacity in relation to the proceedings. The air in the courtroom seemed somehow denser than ordinary air, as though the weight of justice itself had a physical quality that could be felt by those present. Edgar Crane was brought into the courtroom from the holding cells, and Thomas observed his former friend with a mixture of emotions that he struggled to categorize or articulate even to himself. Edgar had changed noticeably since his arrest nearly a year earlier. His face had acquired a kind of gauntness, his hair had grayed more substantially, and his bearing suggested a man who had been diminished by the experience of incarceration and trial. Yet there remained something in Edgar's expression that suggested he had not entirely surrendered his sense of himself, that even in the face of judgment and sentencing, he maintained some interior reserve that resisted complete reduction to the status of criminal condemned. When Edgar's eyes had swept across the courtroom, they had passed directly over Thomas, without any indication of recognition or acknowledgement. Whether this was deliberate, or whether Edgar simply did not perceive Thomas among those present, Thomas could not determine. But the non-recognition had seemed significant, as though it represented a kind of severance of whatever connection had existed between them. The magistrate had delivered the sentence in a voice that was grave but not theatrical, a manner that suggested the weight of his responsibilities was not something he took lightly. Edgar Crane and 3 other principal defendants had been found guilty of conspiracy to traffic in women, of false imprisonment, of assault, and of various other charges. The sentences had been substantial. Edgar had received a sentence of 14 years transportation, which meant that he would be removed from England and would serve out his sentence in one of the colonies established for this purpose. The other principal defendants had received similar sentences, with variations based on the extent of their involvement and the specific nature of their crimes. Several lesser figures involved in the network had received shorter sentences or conditional releases. The pronouncement of the sentence had been followed by a kind of profound silence in the courtroom, a silence that seemed to hold within it the recognition that justice, whatever form it took, was something that was accomplished through the infliction of harm. In this case, the harm of separation from one's home, the loss of liberty, the removal of one's existence from the ordinary geography of the world one had inhabited. Thomas had felt in that silence a kind of mixture of emotions. There was a sense of vindication, certainly. The investigation that he had eventually participated in had resulted in consequences for real crimes. There was also a sense of something like sorrow, a recognition that Edgar, despite what he had done, remained a human being, remained the man whose company Thomas had once valued, remained connected to Thomas through bonds that, while broken, had once been real and had mattered. The proceedings had concluded shortly after the pronouncement of sentence. Those present in the courtroom had gradually filed out into the late summer afternoon. Thomas, Margaret, and William had found themselves outside the courthouse, moving together through the streets of London with a kind of uncertain momentum, as though they were not entirely sure what to do now that the machinery of justice had completed its cycle and had rendered its judgment. Eventually, they had made their way to a quiet public house where they had sat together in a private corner. William had ordered drinks and had raised a kind of toast, suggesting that justice had been served, that the women who had been trafficked could now begin the process of recovery with the knowledge that their perpetrators had faced consequences. Yet even as he had made this statement, William had acknowledged its limitations. "The thing about justice in these matters," he had said, with the weariness of someone who had seen many such cases, "is that it addresses the perpetrator but cannot really restore what was taken from the victim. The sentence is real, the consequence is real, but it does not undo the harm that was done." Margaret had responded to this observation with a kind of practical recognition. "No, but it makes it possible to move forward without the burden of knowing that the person responsible remains free to commit further crimes. It provides a kind of closure, even if not a complete one." She had spoken as someone who had experienced, through her sister's disappearance and recovery, the difference between uncertainty and knowledge, between the open wound of not knowing and the possibility of beginning to heal. Emma, she had explained, was still struggling with the aftermath of her experiences, was still engaging with the trauma that had been inflicted upon her. But the trial and the sentencing had provided Emma with a kind of framework within which her experiences could be understood as crimes, rather than as private misfortunes, and this understanding had given her a kind of agency and clarity that she had been lacking before. In the months that followed the sentencing, Thomas found himself gradually returning to a kind of ordinary existence, though one that had been fundamentally altered by the experiences of the preceding year and a half. The print shop continued much as it had before. Mr. Ashford, perhaps recognizing that Thomas's involvement in the investigation and trial had not diminished his reliability as a worker, continued to employ him and to value his contributions. The newspapers gradually moved on from extensive coverage of the trial, though occasional references to the case continued to appear, particularly when updates emerged regarding the transportation of the convicted defendants or regarding follow-up legal proceedings related to other aspects of the criminal network that had been discovered. The lodging house on Saffron Hill had changed in subtle ways. Edgar's room had been taken over by a new resident, a young clerk who seemed to have no connection to the events that had occurred. Mrs. Briggs had made somewhat cryptic references to the unfortunate business that had occurred at her establishment, but she seemed, for the most part, to have moved past the scandal and had returned her attention to the ordinary management of her house. The other residents, who had become aware through newspaper accounts and street gossip of Thomas's role in the investigation, had treated him with a kind of slightly altered respect, as though he had acquired, through his involvement in matters of justice and consequence, a different status than he had previously possessed. It was also during this period that Thomas and Margaret had begun to discuss marriage with increasing directness and specificity. The relationship that had developed between them over the preceding months had acquired a kind of solidity and commitment that suggested a future that extended beyond mere companionship. Margaret had gradually revealed more about her family circumstances, about her employment at the laundry, about her hopes and fears regarding what a different kind of life might entail. Thomas, in turn, had been able to articulate his own dreams and desires, his recognition that the life of isolation and caution that he had maintained for so long had been incomplete, that he wanted to attempt to construct something different, a shared life characterized by genuine connection and mutual commitment. The practical obstacles to marriage were not insignificant. Thomas's wages as a compositor were modest, sufficient to maintain his own existence, but perhaps not fully adequate to support a wife as well. Margaret's earnings from her work at the laundry were similarly limited. Together, however, they possessed enough economic resources to contemplate establishing a shared residence, though it would necessarily be modest and would require careful financial management. This prospect, the possibility of creating a life together, of establishing a household, of moving into a future that was not predetermined by circumstance, but that was in some sense chosen, had begun to exert a kind of gravitational pull on Thomas's consciousness, drawing him forward toward something that was different from the static existence that had characterized so much of his life. It was Emma who had suggested, with a kind of gentle directness, that Thomas and Margaret should move forward with their plans. Emma had remained in contact with Margaret, and through Margaret she had come to know Thomas better. She had said, in one of their conversations, that she believed that what Margaret needed in order to move forward from the tragedy of her sister's disappearance was the presence of someone who loved her, who could help her construct a life that was oriented toward the future, rather than remaining bound to the past. She had also suggested that Thomas seemed to be someone who had learned, through the events of the preceding months, to understand that life was not something that one could live entirely at a distance, that genuine existence required engagement with others and acceptance of the vulnerability that came with such engagement. In September of 1889, Thomas and Margaret had made a decision to marry. The decision had been made quietly, without fanfare or announcement, though they had informed William and Emma and Mrs. Briggs of their intention. They had made arrangements with the local parish church and had set a date in early October. The prospect of marriage had created a kind of peculiar mixture of anticipation and uncertainty in Thomas. He was entering into a commitment that represented a fundamental alteration of his existence, a movement away from the solitary life that he had maintained for so long and toward something that would involve genuine interdependence and vulnerability. Yet he had come to understand that this was not a retreat or a failure, but rather a fulfillment of something that had always been present, but that had been suppressed by his philosophy of caution and his fear of the consequences of genuine engagement with others. The wedding had taken place on an overcast day in early October, in a small parish church not far from where Thomas and Margaret lived. The ceremony had been attended by William, by Emma, by Mrs. Briggs, and by a handful of others who had become connected to their lives through the events of the preceding months. The vicar, who had conducted the ceremony, had made observations about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment and faithfulness, observations that had seemed to Thomas to carry a particular weight given what he and Margaret had experienced in their journey toward this moment. When the vicar had pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas had felt a sense of something shifting, a kind of settlement into a new reality in which he was no longer simply Thomas Wickham, compositor, but also Thomas Wickham, husband. In the weeks following the marriage, Thomas and Margaret had taken a modest flat in a building not far from where Margaret had worked at the laundry. The flat consisted of 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a larger room that served as both bedroom and sitting room. The furnishings were sparse and humble, acquired gradually through careful saving and the occasional gift from friends and family. Yet there was something about the flat that seemed to Thomas to be entirely his and Margaret's, a space that they had created together, and that represented a future that was genuinely shared. Margaret had given notice at the laundry, not permanently, but to take time to establish their household and to begin to imagine what a different kind of life might look like. She had suggested that she might eventually seek work in a shop or perhaps in a bookshop, work that would be somewhat less physically demanding than laundry work and that would allow for more flexibility in her schedule. Thomas continued at the print shop, continued to perform his work as a compositor with the same precision that he had always brought to it, but with a subtle difference in his consciousness of what the work meant. He was no longer simply performing labor in order to secure his own survival. He was contributing to the material foundation of a shared life, and this gave his work a different quality of significance. One afternoon in late October, Thomas had been walking home from the print shop and had found himself, almost without intention, passing through the neighborhood where he had encountered Emma in the fog nearly 2 years earlier. The street was much as it had been at that time, though the fog was not present. It was a clear, cool afternoon, the kind of afternoon that suggested winter approaching. He had paused for a moment on the street, attempting to locate the precise spot where the encounter had occurred. It was difficult to identify with certainty. The street looked much like many other streets in London, characterized by a kind of anonymous dreariness that was typical of working-class neighborhoods. Yet, standing there, Thomas had found himself reflecting on the fact that this spot, this apparently ordinary and unremarkable location, was the site of an encounter that had ultimately transformed his entire existence. The encounter with Emma had been, in some sense, a moment of genuine crisis for Thomas. He had been offered the opportunity to respond to someone's appeal for help, to use his particular skills and knowledge to address an injustice. He had failed to respond, had chosen silence and caution over action and engagement. Yet that failure, paradoxically, had eventually led him toward a life that was more authentic and more connected than the life he had been living before. If he had responded immediately to Emma's appeal, if he had revealed the clipping and the message to the police without hesitation, his life might have taken a different trajectory. But it seemed to Thomas that the particular journey that he had actually taken, through months of internal conflict, through the gradual recognition of the cost of his silence, through eventual participation in the investigation and trial, had perhaps prepared him in a way that a more direct response would not have done. He had learned, through this process, about the relationship between action and consequence, about the ways that individual choices rippled outward to affect others, about the possibility of redemption and transformation, even when one had failed, initially, to act as one ought. By late autumn of 1889, as the year approached its conclusion, Thomas had settled into a kind of new existence that felt both unfamiliar and somehow deeply right. He remained a compositor in the print shop, occupied the same position in the working hierarchy that he had occupied before. Yet the significance of that position had altered. He was no longer invisible, no longer moving through the world without connection or consequence. He had participated in matters of genuine importance. His testimony had contributed to the conviction and sentencing of people who had committed serious crimes. His marriage to Margaret represented a commitment to a shared future, to a life that was no longer solitary and circumscribed, but that was open to the possibility of genuine connection with another person. The newspapers that passed through his hands at the print shop no longer seemed to carry the particular weight of fear and anxiety that had characterized them during the period of the Whitechapel murders and the early stages of the investigation into trafficking. The public consciousness had moved on to other matters, other scandals, other sources of concern and curiosity. But for Thomas, and for those connected to him through Margaret and Emma and William, the events of the preceding years had left marks that would not entirely fade. They had learned something about the architecture of crime and suffering in the city, about the ways that systematic injustice could be concealed beneath the surface of ordinary commerce and ordinary life, about the possibility of addressing such injustice through the mechanisms of law and justice. They had learned also about the importance of bearing witness, about the ways that individual testimony could contribute to collective understanding and collective action. Time moves with a peculiar quality in the memory of those who have lived through significant events. A year passes, then another, and the vividness of what seems so immediate and pressing gradually fades into the texture of accumulated experience. For Thomas Wickham, now approaching his 38th year, the events of 1888 and 1889 had acquired something of the quality of a story that had happened to someone else, a narrative that he could recall with clarity, but that no longer possessed the immediate emotional force that it had once exerted. Yet the consequences of those events remained present in his daily life, embedded in the choices he had made and the relationships he had constructed. It was spring of 1890 when the moment that might be called the true epilogue to this sequence of events occurred. Thomas was sitting in the small flat that he and Margaret had inhabited for the past several months, a space that had gradually acquired the quality of a genuine home through the accumulation of objects and routines and the daily intimacy of shared living. The flat was modest, 2 rooms, modest furnishings, the kind of dwelling that was typical for people of their station and means. Yet it was theirs, and in that ownership lay a kind of dignity and security that Thomas had not experienced in his earlier years of lodging-house existence. Margaret was engaged in needlework, mending one of Thomas's shirts with the kind of methodical precision that she brought to all of her activities. There was a quality of comfortable silence between them, a silence that spoke of familiarity and ease rather than distance or awkwardness. The evening light was beginning to fade. It was that peculiar time of day when the distinction between afternoon and evening had not yet fully resolved itself, when light seemed suspended in a kind of golden indeterminacy. A newspaper lay on the small table beside Thomas, one of the publications that the print shop had produced earlier that week. He had brought it home deliberately, drawn to an article that had appeared in it regarding the establishment of a new organization dedicated to investigating and addressing trafficking in women and children. The article had mentioned, in passing, the investigation that had concluded nearly 2 years earlier, and had referenced the conviction of Edgar Crane and the other defendants. The name Edgar Crane appeared in print, rendered in the same typeface and format as any other name, transformed through the medium of print into a kind of historical fact, rather than the living memory of a person whom Thomas had known. Margaret had glanced at the newspaper and had asked, with the directness that had become characteristic of her since her marriage to Thomas, whether the article was troubling him. Thomas had responded honestly that it was not troubling him exactly, but rather that it had prompted a kind of reflection about how the events of the preceding years had been transformed into public narrative, how they had been processed through the machinery of journalism and had become, in some sense, part of the general knowledge of the public, rather than remaining as private experience. Margaret had suggested that this transformation was perhaps not entirely negative, that it meant that the crimes that had been committed were no longer hidden, that they were part of the collective understanding of the city, that this understanding might help to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. The conversation had been interrupted by a knock at the door. Unexpected visitors were not common in their quiet domestic life. When Thomas had opened the door, he had discovered William, who had appeared with the kind of directness that suggested he had not planned to call, but had found himself in the neighborhood and had decided to visit. William had been warmly welcomed, and Margaret had excused herself to the small kitchen to prepare tea. When she had departed, William had seated himself in the sparse sitting room and had explained the purpose of his visit. He had come, he said, because he had received news that might be of interest to Thomas. Emma had contacted him with information, suggesting that the investigation into trafficking had begun to expand further, to encompass additional networks that operated in other parts of England. William had been promoted to a position with somewhat greater authority and responsibility in relation to these investigations, and he had been thinking about Thomas's potential involvement in future matters. William had explained that Thomas's testimony at the trial, combined with his particular skills as a compositor and his capacity to observe details that others might miss, made him potentially valuable as an unofficial consultant to future investigations. William had suggested that Thomas might be willing to cooperate with the police should future matters arise that required his particular knowledge or perspective. The suggestion had prompted in Thomas a complex mixture of reactions. There was a kind of flattery involved in being regarded as someone whose skills and judgment were valuable enough to warrant official attention. There was also a kind of reluctance. Thomas had only recently emerged from the intense involvement with the investigation and trial, and the prospect of potentially being drawn into future matters created a kind of anxiety about whether he would be able to maintain the equilibrium and peace that he had begun to construct in his marriage and his domestic life. Thomas had responded to William's suggestion with careful ambivalence, suggesting that while he was willing in principle to cooperate with investigations should his knowledge or perspective prove relevant, he hoped that no such matters would emerge in the near future. William had accepted this response with apparent understanding, had suggested that such cooperation would likely be occasional rather than constant, and had assured Thomas that he would not be asked to involve himself in matters unless there was a genuine need for his particular knowledge. The conversation had then shifted to more personal territory. with William inquiring about Thomas's marriage, about his work at the print shop, about his general state of mind and well-being. Thomas had responded with what appeared to be genuine contentment, had described his marriage as having exceeded his expectations in terms of the companionship and understanding that it provided, had noted that his work continued to provide both material security and a kind of intellectual satisfaction through his engagement with the printed word. When William had departed, approximately an hour later, Margaret had returned from the kitchen and had inquired what the visit had been about. Thomas had explained the substance of William's conversation, had described the suggestion that he might be asked to cooperate with future investigations. Margaret had responded with a kind of thoughtful consideration, had suggested that while she understood Thomas's desire to maintain distance from potentially disruptive matters, there might also be value in remaining connected to the work of addressing injustice. That such work might provide a kind of purpose that extended beyond the ordinary requirements of daily labor. "You have been changed by what you experienced," Margaret had said, with the directness that had become characteristic of her. "It would be a loss if that change were simply to be set aside, if you were to return to being entirely invisible to the world and to yourself." The conversation had prompted in Thomas a kind of reconsideration of his relationship to the events that had occurred and their aftermath. He had spent the preceding year attempting to return to a kind of ordinary existence, had deliberately tried to minimize the significance of his involvement in the investigation and trial, had focused his attention and his energy on the construction of his marriage and his domestic life. Yet Margaret's suggestion implied that this return to ordinariness might itself be a kind of evasion, that the consciousness that had been awakened in him through the events of 1888 and 1889 could not simply be set aside or returned to a dormant state. To do so would be to betray, in some sense, the significance of what he had learned about himself and about the world. As spring progressed into early summer, Thomas found himself in a state of quiet reflection about these matters. He continued to work at the print shop, continued to move through the daily routines of his life with Margaret. Yet, there was an addition to his consciousness now, a recognition that the events of the preceding years had fundamentally altered who he was and what he was capable of, that he bore a kind of responsibility, not onerous, but genuine, to allow that altered self to continue to develop and to contribute, in whatever small ways might be possible, to the work of addressing injustice and suffering in the world. One afternoon in late summer, Thomas was working at the print shop on a particularly delicate job, a series of broadsides for a charitable organization dedicated to the protection of children and the prevention of trafficking. The irony of the assignment had not escaped him. He was setting type for words that advocated against the very crimes that Edgar Crane and his associates had committed. The words that he was composing, letter by letter, sentence by sentence, would be disseminated throughout London, read by members of the public who might be unaware of the extent to which trafficking and exploitation persisted beneath the surface of ordinary commerce and ordinary life. As he worked, Thomas had found himself reflecting on the particular power of print, on the way that words rendered in type acquired a kind of permanence and authority that they might not possess when simply spoken. The words that he was setting into type would persist, would exist in copies that would circulate through the city and perhaps beyond, would contribute in their small way to the public consciousness about matters of importance. Mr. Ashford had observed Thomas working on the broadsides with what appeared to be particular attention, had commented that Thomas seemed to be bringing an unusual degree of care to the work. When Thomas had been asked whether there was some particular reason for this heightened attention, he had found himself attempting to articulate something that he had not previously put into words. He had suggested that all work had significance, that the quality of one's engagement with one's labor mattered, that even the seemingly routine act of setting type was part of a larger architecture of meaning and communication that connected individual effort to collective understanding. Mr. Ashford had responded with apparent surprise at this philosophical observation from his ordinarily taciturn compositor, had suggested that perhaps Thomas had been reading too much philosophy in his spare time, had commented with rough humor that it was good that Thomas had found some way to invest his labor with significance, though he hoped this would not result in a decrease in Thomas's productivity or an increase in his wages expectations. As autumn arrived once again, marking more than a year since Thomas's marriage to Margaret, Thomas found himself occasionally passing by the locations that had been significant during the events of 1888 and 1889. The lodging house on Saffron Hill, where he had lived when he encountered Emma in the fog, he would pass by it occasionally on his way to different parts of the city, and he would feel a kind of strange recognition, as though he were seeing the physical location of an event that seemed simultaneously immediate and remote. The laundry where Margaret had worked, where they had first begun to develop some kind of connection, it remained in operation, though Margaret no longer worked there. Sometimes Margaret would suggest that they walk past it, and they would do so together, and there would be an unspoken acknowledgement between them of how much had changed since that time. The city itself seemed to Thomas to have moved on from the intensity of the events that had so occupied public consciousness in 1888 and 1889. The newspapers carried stories of other crimes, other scandals, other sources of public concern and fascination. The Whitechapel murders, which had seemed at the time to represent some kind of fundamental rupture in the social order, had faded from the daily consciousness of most people, though for those who had been directly affected by the crimes or by the subsequent investigation into trafficking, the events had left marks that would not easily fade. Thomas understood that he was now one of those people for whom the events of that period would remain significant, would continue to shape his consciousness and his choices in ways that were not always conscious or articulate. By late autumn of 1890, as the second anniversary of Edgar's arrest approached, Thomas had achieved a kind of settlement in his consciousness about what had occurred and what it meant. He had participated in a significant historical event, had contributed to the achievement of justice for serious crimes, had learned important lessons about himself and about the world. He had also, through the process of participation in these events, been transformed from a man whose life was conducted at a distance from genuine engagement with others into someone who was capable of genuine connection and commitment. The marriage to Margaret represented the most significant consequence of this transformation. In their shared life, in the daily routines of their existence together, in the conversations they had and the silences they inhabited, there was a kind of grace that Thomas had not anticipated would be available to him. On an evening in late November, as darkness descended earlier and earlier with each passing day, Thomas sat reading in their small flat, while Margaret worked on mending. The fire in the small grate provided a kind of focal point for the room, a gathering place for their attention and their warmth. Outside, London proceeded with its ordinary business. People moved through the streets. Commerce occurred. Life was lived in all its various manifestations. Inside, in this small space that was theirs, there was a kind of peace that seemed to Thomas to be genuine, even if it was not complete, even if it existed alongside the knowledge of suffering and injustice that persisted in the world beyond their small sphere. Margaret had set aside her mending and had asked Thomas, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, what he was reading. Thomas had explained that it was a philosophical text that he had recently acquired, a book that dealt with questions of conscience and responsibility, with the ways that individuals were situated within larger social structures and the degree to which they bore responsibility for addressing injustice within those structures. Margaret had asked whether the text provided any answers to these questions, or whether it simply posed the questions in increasingly complex ways. Thomas had laughed, had suggested that the latter seemed to be the case, that philosophy seemed to be largely an enterprise of refining one's questions rather than arriving at definitive answers. Yet he had also suggested that there was something valuable in this process, that the refining of one's questions represented a kind of movement toward greater clarity and deeper understanding, even if certainty remained elusive. The conversation had drifted into the comfortable terrain of thoughts exchanged between people who were genuinely intimate, thoughts that were not urgent or demanding, but rather represented the texture of shared consciousness. Margaret had mentioned that Emma had written to her, had indicated that she was considering moving to a different part of the country, perhaps to take a position in a charitable organization dedicated to the protection of vulnerable women. She had suggested that the work of addressing the crimes that had been committed against her and others might constitute a kind of redemption, a transformation of her suffering into purpose. Thomas had reflected that this seemed fitting, that Emma's movement from victimhood to participation in the work of protecting others represented a kind of trajectory that was deeply meaningful. As the evening had progressed toward night, as the fire in the grate had gradually burned down to embers, Thomas had found himself in a state of profound, quiet contentment. The events of the preceding years had been difficult and transformative. They had drawn him out of the safety of his invisibility into a realm of genuine engagement with others and with matters of consequence. They had forced him to confront the limitations of his philosophy of caution, to recognize that survival alone was not sufficient as a goal, that some form of genuine connection and participation in the world was necessary for life to have meaning. The investigation into the trafficking crimes had been concluded, the guilty had been sentenced, the victims had been restored to whatever degree such restoration was possible. His own small role in these events had been completed, and yet the consequences of his participation continued to ripple outward, continued to shape his consciousness and his choices. Thomas understood that the future held uncertainties, that William's suggestion that he might be asked to cooperate with future investigations meant that he might not remain indefinitely in the peaceful obscurity of his domestic life. He understood also that the work of addressing injustice and suffering in the world was ongoing, that there were always more crimes to investigate, more victims to protect, more systems of exploitation to expose and dismantle. Yet in this moment, sitting in the quiet of his small flat with his wife, with the embers of the fire providing a gentle warmth, with the knowledge that they had constructed together something genuine and meaningful. In this moment, Thomas could imagine that the future, whatever it held, might be met with a kind of steady presence, rather than the anxious caution that had previously characterized his approach to life. The